Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Nervebound, the life that wasn't mine. I wasn't supposed to work that night. The late shift at the convenience store was usually covered by someone else, but Emily had called out sick, and there I was, clocking in at 10 p.m. The city was quiet when I left the apartment, only the distant, occasional rumble of traffic and the faint glow of streetlights cutting through the drizzle. It was the kind of weather that made you want to stay indoors, but rent was due, and bills wouldn't pay themselves. The 24-hour gas station sat on the corner of Madison and 8th, wedged between a closed-down laundromat and a shuttered pawn shop. It was the kind of place people stopped at out of necessity, not choice. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed faintly, casting a sterile pallor over the rows of snacks and cheap drinks. I was used to the grimy, tired energy that hung in the air, the smell of stale cigarettes and spilled soda. The first hour was uneventful. Customers came and went, mostly late-night shift workers or people coming from the bars down the street. I kept the register humming, restocked shelves mindlessly, and glanced at the security footage on the monitors behind the counter. Nothing unusual. Just the usual street silhouettes pass under the flickering orange streetlights outside. At 11:45, a man came in. I remember the way he stood in the doorway, hesitating. He was maybe in his late 40s, wearing a dark blue jacket zipped all the way up despite the warmth inside, his hands shoved deep into the pockets. His face was shadowed by the low brim of a black baseball cap, but I caught a glimpse of his pale eyes scanning the store like he was searching for something or someone. He moved slowly down the aisles, barely looking at the shelves. When he reached the back corner near the cigarettes, he stopped and turned his head sharply toward me. Our eyes locked for a brief, unsettling moment before he turned away and kept walking. I felt a strange chill crawl up my spine, even though I knew there was no reason to be afraid. People acted weird sometimes. Maybe he was drunk or just tired. Still, I kept watching him out of the corner of my eye. Then, without a word, he moved toward the counter, placing an old, beat-up leather wallet on the glass surface. I looked up and asked if he needed help finding something. He mumbled something that I couldn't hear and reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled $5 bill to pay for a pack of cigarettes. As I handed them over, I noticed his hands trembled slightly, and under the dim lights, the skin looked almost translucent. He nodded curtly and shuffled toward the exit. The moment the door closed behind him, I felt the tense weight in the room lift a little. But when I checked the footage again, I realized the timestamp had jumped strangely for a few seconds during his visit. That was odd, but probably a glitch. I always told myself I was overthinking things. Not long after, at around 12:15 a.m., a woman came in. She seemed out of place, young, maybe early 20s, wearing a bright red hoodie zipped up tight, the hood pulled over her head despite the store's warmth. Her eyes were wide, darting nervously toward the door and then the aisles. She kept fiddling with her phone, sending quick texts, glancing at the screen as if waiting for a reply that never came. I tried to catch her eye to offer help, but she kept looking away, biting her lip. When she finally approached the counter, it was to buy a single bottle of water. Her hands were shaking, and she paid with a handful of coins, dropping some on the counter. I bent down to help pick them up, but she grabbed the bottle and slipped out the door so fast I barely had time to say goodbye. The bell above the door jingled sharply, and I watched her disappear into the foggy night. Something about the way she moved, urgent but cautious, made me uncomfortable. I kept an eye on the exit, half expecting her to come back or for someone to follow her. Minutes passed. The store was quiet again. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional beep of the cash register, and the distant muffled sounds of the city filled the space. Then, just after 12:40, the power flickered. For a second, the fluorescent bulbs dimmed, then surged back to their harsh brightness. The monitors behind me blinked off, then came back on, but the security feed was scrambled, showing only static and broken images. I grabbed the backup flashlight under the counter and shone it toward the entrance. The rain had picked up outside, hitting the windows with a steady patter. I noticed a shadow lingering just beyond the glass, too large and still to be an animal. My heartbeat quickened. I considered calling the police, but the phone behind the counter was dead. I reached for my cell, only to find it had no signal. Just great. The shadow didn't move for several minutes. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. A tall figure stepped inside, dripping wet, wearing a soaked leather jacket and jeans. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but I could see his jaw clenched tight. "Hey," he said, voice low and rough. "I need to use your phone." I swallowed hard. Something about him felt dangerous, but desperation or not, I knew I couldn't just say no. "Sure," I said, stepping back to the counter. "It's over there." I gestured toward the payphone mounted on the wall near the door. He didn't move right away. Instead, he scanned the store, eyes lingering on me, the aisles, the cameras. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said after a moment. "Just need to make a quick call. It's an emergency." My hands were shaking slightly. I wanted to trust him, but the tension in the air was thick. I kept thinking about the glitches with the cameras, the strange people before him, the failing phone line. Each little thing added up, but I couldn't pinpoint why I felt so on edge. He finally moved toward the phone, nodding thanks. I stayed behind the counter, watching every move. As he lifted the receiver, the door jangled again. I glanced up and saw the woman in the red hoodie standing just beyond the threshold, staring in. She mouthed something I couldn't hear. Her eyes were wide, frantic. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Whatever was happening outside, whoever was out there, it wasn't over. For the first time since my shift started, I realized I wasn't alone, and none of this was random. The night was just beginning. It was just after 6 when I left the little cafe. The sun had slipped behind the rooftops, leaving the streets colder and dimmer than I'd expected for early fall. I zipped up my jacket, the thin wind tugging at the collar, and pulled the strap of my bag tighter across my shoulder. My phone was low on battery, and since I'd neglected to bring the charger to work, I'd been trying to conserve power all day. I switched it off before leaving, deciding I didn't really need it for the 10-minute walk home. The neighborhood was quiet, the usual hum of afternoon chatter replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and distant cars. I passed the small park near the corner, the playground empty and shadowed, the swing still. A man sat on one of the benches, hunched forward, his hands clasped between his knees. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. I didn't think much of it. The park had a lot of early evening joggers and dog walkers, and sometimes people used the benches to rest. But as I walked past, I noticed he didn't move or look up. Usually, someone would glance around or check their phone. He just sat, unmoving, staring at the ground. I kept my gaze ahead, trying not to seem interested, but a knot tightened in my stomach. I turned right at the corner, taking the route I always did. Fewer streetlights here, just 1 or 2 flickering badly. The uneven pavement was cracked, with bits of gravel pushed into the gaps. I kept my pace steady, but I could hear footsteps behind me, light but consistent. I glanced over my shoulder. The man in the hoodie was following me. He was keeping his distance, maybe 20 feet back, but his presence was unmistakable. I crossed the street, hoping to shake him, but he mirrored me without hesitation. I tried to quicken my steps, my shoes scraping against the concrete, but the footsteps grew louder, matching my rhythm. My heart thumped in my chest. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. There was a convenience store up ahead, its fluorescent lights buzzing inside and out. I thought maybe I could duck inside, grab a snack, and wait for him to pass. I stepped through the automatic doors, the bell chiming behind me. The store was mostly empty, just the cashier behind the register and a woman selecting a lottery ticket. I stood near the drink fridge, pretending to look at the shelves, and peeked through the glass door. The man was still outside, just standing by the curb, as if waiting. He looked up and met my eyes for a split second before turning his head away. That brief glance sent a shiver down my spine. I told the cashier I'd just grab a water, but I didn't move. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for a bottle. The man remained outside, his stance relaxed but deliberate. The street was quiet except for a distant siren, wailing softly and fading. After what felt like minutes, but was probably only a couple of moments, the man stepped away from the curb and walked down the street in the opposite direction. I exhaled, tension releasing like tight ropes unwinding. I paid for my water and stepped back into the dusk. The street seemed empty now, the earlier weight lifted, but my nerves still buzzed. I retraced my steps toward home, this time keeping to the better lit roads and avoiding the darker side streets. When I finally reached my apartment building, the door was slightly ajar. I stopped short, heart pounding again. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked that morning. The lobby was dark, the overhead light flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the mailbox racks. I pushed the door gently. It swung inward with a creak. I called out, "Hello," but there was no answer. My hand shook as I pulled out my keys and flicked on my phone's flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the staircase and the hallway leading to the elevator. Everything looked normal. No signs of forced entry or disturbance. Still, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I hurried up the steps, 2 at a time, my breath short and shallow. When I reached my floor, I checked the door to my apartment. Locked. I slipped the key in and turned it slowly, then pushed the door open. Inside, the apartment was quiet and dim. I flicked on the lights, scanning the rooms. Nothing was out of place. The couch cushions were where I left them, the kitchen table clear except for the dishes from breakfast. I felt some small relief settle in my chest. But then I heard a faint tapping, coming from the window facing the alley behind the building. I froze. The window was closed, but the tapping continued, soft but irregular. I edged toward it, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would give me away. Through the glass, I caught a glimpse of movement, just a shadow shifting behind the dumpster. I jerked back and locked the window, pulling the curtain shut. My hands were clammy, and I sat down hard on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. The tapping didn't start again, but the unease lingered, thick and heavy. I wanted to convince myself it was just some animal or a branch brushing the glass, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, maybe even waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every distant sound made me jump. I kept the door locked and checked the window once more before curling up with the lights on until dawn. The next morning, I called the building manager and asked if anyone else had reported strange people around or if the door had been left unlocked. She said no, but promised to send the maintenance guy to check all the locks and lights. Still, I felt exposed, like the safety of my home had been breached in some invisible way. I kept my keys close and my phone charged. And when I left for work that evening, I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder every few steps, wondering if the man in the hoodie was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting. I told myself I was being paranoid when I locked the front door twice that night, even though it clicked shut just fine the first time. It was late, around 11:30, and I just finished rewatching an old movie, something banal that should have helped me unwind. But the quiet in the apartment felt wrong. Too thick. The hum of the heater was the only sound, and yet it seemed louder than usual, like the silence was pressing in. I lived alone in a small, second-floor unit in a building that used to be a factory. High ceilings, exposed brick, a few creaky floorboards. It wasn't the safest neighborhood, but it wasn't the worst either. I'd lived here for 2 years without incident. Until the last few days. Then came the knocks. The first knock was light, almost hesitant. I thought it was the upstairs neighbor at first, but when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. Just the dimly lit hallway and the flickering fluorescent light above the stairwell. I didn't say anything, didn't open the door. Then came the second time. It was later, around 9 p.m. again. This time the knocking was sharper, more urgent, 3 quick raps. When I glanced out, I saw a man standing across the hall, under the emergency exit sign. He wasn't someone I recognized. His face was shadowed by a baseball cap, and he was wearing a heavy jacket despite the mild spring weather. I didn't open the door. He stared at me for a long moment before walking down the stairs. That's when I started to feel like something was off. I told myself it was some drifter or lost delivery guy, or maybe someone just looking for a place to crash. But I didn't want to find out. So when I heard the knock again that night, softer this time, almost like a tap on glass, my heart jumped hard enough to catch in my throat. I was in the kitchen, rinsing a glass, when it came. I froze, glass in hand, ears straining. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. When I finally looked out again, the hall was empty. The emergency light hummed overhead, buzzing faintly. I locked the door twice and made sure the chain was on. Then I grabbed my phone and sat down on the couch, trying to will myself to stop looking at the peephole. But my eyes kept flicking to the door. Every creak in the building's old pipes was amplified. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, but inside the apartment, the silence was suffocating. I texted a friend, Sarah, who lived a few blocks away. Told her about the knocking. She said it was probably nothing and that I should call the landlord if it happened again. I promised I would. The next morning, I went about my routine, but I avoided the front door as much as possible. I left through the back fire escape to get to the bus stop. On the street, the chill of dawn still hung in the air. The neighborhood was quieter than usual, no kids playing, few people out. I kept glancing over my shoulder, every shadow seeming to stretch longer than it should. At work, I told a few colleagues about the knocking. They shrugged it off, probably some homeless guy or a prankster, one said. Still, I noticed one of them, a guy named Marcus, kept glancing at me with a strange look. Like he was worried or maybe knew something but wasn't saying. I didn't press him. That evening, I decided to run an errand after dinner, buy some groceries and maybe a bottle of wine to calm my nerves. I left around 7 p.m., the streetlights flickering on. The store was a 5-minute walk, and I took the usual route, down the main road, past the park. On the way back, I felt it again, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I quickened my pace without looking back. The street was mostly deserted except for a few late stragglers heading home or to bars. At the corner near my building, I saw a figure standing under the street lamp. The man wore the same heavy jacket and baseball cap from earlier. He didn't move or turn as I passed, just stared. My heart raced, palms sweating. I kept walking, faster now. When I reached the stairwell to my building, I looked back. He was still standing there, leaning against a lamppost, the light casting half his face in shadow. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a mouse caught in a trap. Inside the building, I took the stairs 2 at a time, locked the door behind me, and bolted it. I checked the peephole. Nothing. I exhaled shakily, hands trembling as I dropped my bags. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, the creak of the radiator, the distant siren, the heavy footsteps of neighbors made me jump. I sat in the dark, phone in hand, debating whether to call the cops. But what would I say? Someone knocking? Standing under a light? Without proof, it sounded crazy. The next day was worse. I found a scrap of paper slipped under my door when I came home from work. It was small, ripped from a notebook, with 3 words scrawled in messy, hurried handwriting, "I'm watching you." I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run. Instead, I sat on the floor in the dim hallway, clutching the paper like it was some fragile lifeline. The building was empty and silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside. I called Sarah again, my voice barely steady. She told me to stay with her that night. I packed a bag, grabbed the paper, and left. At her apartment, the safety was thin but real, doors locked, chains on, a dog that barked at shadows. I thought maybe, just maybe, the nightmare had paused. But the next morning, as I looked out Sarah's window, I saw a man standing across the street, under a streetlight, looking up at the building. He wore the same jacket, the same cap, and this time, he was holding something in his hand. A camera. The evening started like any other Thursday after work, quiet and unremarkable. I was walking home from the subway station, clutching my bag close against the chill air that had settled over the city. The streets were slick with the trace of rain, the pavement reflecting the dull glow of street lamps. I kept my head down, my thoughts drifting between meals to cook and a text I meant to send but forgot. It was the kind of night that blurred into the background, the sort of night where nothing happened. That was until I noticed the man. I first saw him standing outside the convenience store at the corner of 6th and Pine. He was leaning against the wall, one leg crossed over the other, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn black jacket. He looked up when I approached but didn't say anything. His eyes held mine for an uncomfortable moment before he turned and entered the store without a word. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was waiting for someone, or just taking a cigarette break. But as I passed, I realized my pace had slowed without me noticing. The strangest thing was the way his gaze lingered, the way it seemed to follow me through the store's glass door. I felt the faint, icy prickles of unease in my scalp and tried to shake it off. The next block felt longer, the sounds of the city duller. I picked up my pace, ears straining for footsteps behind me. I could hear the hum of cars, the distant shout of a drunk couple, but no footsteps matching mine. I told myself I was imagining things. I turned onto my street, a relatively quiet residential lane lined with old brick buildings and small front yards. The streetlight nearest my building flickered faintly, casting a weak, uneven glow. I reached the door of my apartment complex and fumbled for my keys, my fingers trembling slightly. The lock clicked open, and I stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind me. I paused in the dimly lit foyer, waiting to catch my breath and calm the rapid thumping of my heart. Then a sound made me freeze, a faint scraping, like nails on glass or maybe a finger tracing the window beside the door. My eyes darted toward the small unlocked window panel. It was cracked open just a few inches. A cold wave of realization washed over me. I hadn't left that window open. I knew I hadn't. My phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. I bent to retrieve it, trying to steady my racing mind. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was thicker and heavier than anything before. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe a window had been left open earlier by the building maintenance or another tenant. I checked the hallway, empty. No sign of anyone. I hurried upstairs, each step echoing against the bare concrete walls. My apartment door came into view, its familiar frame somehow more menacing in the dim light. I fumbled with my keys again, my hands slick with sweat. When I finally got the door open, I flipped the light switch. The room spilled into view exactly as I had left it, my jacket draped over the chair, a half-empty mug on the kitchen counter, my laptop glowing softly on the table. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed missing. But then I saw it. On the floor, near the back door that led to the small fire escape, there was a single footprint in the dust, a muddy, wet print, unmistakably fresh. I blinked at it, then looked up and down the apartment. The back door was locked, the chain still in place, but the window beside it, a small one that I always kept closed, was cracked open just a bit. Not enough to crawl through easily, but enough for someone to slip a hand inside. I swallowed hard and closed the window. My phone buzzed suddenly in my pocket. I pulled it out, heart pounding, expecting it to be a message from a friend or work. Instead, it was a notification from the subway app: your next train arrives in 10 minutes. I frowned. I hadn't checked any transit apps in hours. Then came another message. No name, just a number I didn't recognize. You're home. My breath caught. I checked the message again, then looked around the apartment as if the walls themselves might answer. I called my landlord, voice shaky, telling him about the window. He promised to come by in the morning to change the locks and check the building's security cameras. I told him I'd call the police if he didn't. After I hung up, I spent the rest of the night locking and relocking every door and window. I didn't turn off any lights, and I left the TV on to drown out the silence. I sat on my couch, biting my nails, every noise outside making me jump: the rustling of leaves, the distant siren, footsteps echoing in the hallway. I kept the blinds drawn tight, the curtains pulled close. At some point, exhaustion took over, but I didn't dare close my eyes. I listened to every creak, every groan of the old building, waiting, watching, afraid that the man from the corner store wasn't just a stranger but something worse. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray, I was still awake, sitting stiff and trembling. The city had come back to life outside my window, but the quiet dread inside me remained. I knew this was only the beginning. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window, steady and soft like a whispered warning, but the house was otherwise silent. The clock on the bedside table read 3:14 a.m. I lay there for a moment, heart thudding in the dark, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the usual late-night noises that every creaky old place makes. But something felt off. The air was heavy, the kind of humid chill I could both feel and smell, a mix of damp fabric and something metallic, faint but distinct, like old pennies left out in the rain. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to awaken Jenny, and padded over to the window. The streetlight outside cast a dull yellow pool on the wet pavement, but the front yard was dark beyond the reach of its glow. A movement flickered near the gate, a shadow? A person? I squinted, heart quickening. It was too dark to make out, but the shape was definitely there. Still, the rain blurred everything, and after a few seconds, it vanished. I shut the curtains and went to the kitchen for a glass of water, my bare feet cold on the wooden floorboards. The house felt suddenly much larger, more empty, the familiar corners sharper, more alien. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe just a neighbor out walking their dog, or someone passing by on the street. Back in bed, I tried to fall asleep, but the rain had unleashed a strange kind of quiet terror. Every creak seemed louder. Every gust of wind rattled the window pane like a faint knocking. I was frozen in place, listening for any sign of movement outside the house. After what felt like hours, I dozed off. The next morning, I found the door to the backyard unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. The lock wasn't broken, no sign of forced entry, just swung open as if someone had forgotten to close it all the way. My stomach twisted. I told myself it had to be me. Maybe I'd been distracted when I came in, but the dread lingered. I called Jenny at work. She sounded upbeat, but I caught a flicker of unease when I told her about the door. She promised she would come home early to check things out. Later that afternoon, the neighborhood felt different. The usual hum of children playing, lawnmowers, and barking dogs was muted. I walked down our street to the corner store, trying to shake the feeling that someone was watching me. At the crosswalk, I noticed a man standing on the opposite side. He was average height, wearing a faded jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Nothing remarkable, except he didn't move when the light changed. Everyone else crossed, but he stayed rooted, eyes locked on me. I looked away, quickening my pace. At the store, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The man wasn't there anymore. But as I left, I caught sight of him again, just outside the entrance, pretending to look at his phone but watching me all the same. I forced myself into the car and drove home, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, every shadow on the road turning into a threat. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw a small note tucked under the windshield wiper. My breath caught. The note was handwritten in uneven, hurried letters. I know what you did. You can't hide. No signature. No explanation. I scanned the street. No one else around. My phone felt suddenly useless in my pocket, though it was fully charged. I locked every door, double-checked the windows, and called Jenny again. She told me to call the police if I felt in danger, but I hesitated. What would I say? A creepy note? A stranger watching me? It all sounded like paranoia. But my fingers shook so badly I could barely hold the phone. That night, I slept with the lights on, a baseball bat resting beside the bed. The rain had stopped, but the thick fog that rolled and blanketed the neighborhood, muting every sound. I thought I heard footsteps on the porch around midnight, soft and deliberate. I froze, listening. Nothing followed. No knock, no voice, no scratching. Just silence. The next morning, Jenny came home early. We went through the house together, doors and windows locked tight, checking for any sign of forced entry or tampering. There was none. But I found something else, a small, scuffed footprint on the back porch floor, damp and fresh. It didn't match my shoes or Jenny's. It was small, maybe a kid's. We called the police and filed a report, but without evidence beyond the note and the footprint, they could do little. They suggested installing cameras, extra locks, maybe even an alarm system. We agreed, but it felt like putting a bandage on a wound that was still bleeding. Over the following days, the man with the cap appeared again, lurking at odd times near our house. Sometimes he parked his car a few houses down, engine running, staring blankly at our direction. I started keeping a log of his appearances, but it didn't make me feel any safer. One evening, I was outside throwing away the trash when I saw him cross the street, moving quickly, head down. My heart hammered in my chest. I locked the door behind me and called Jenny immediately. We sat together, doors locked, waiting for the night to pass. That night, the tension finally broke. Around 2 a.m., I heard a loud bang on the front door. Then another. My breath caught and I stumbled out of bed, grabbing the bat again. The banging turned into heavy thuds, as if someone was trying to break the door down. I dialed 911 with trembling fingers and whispered my address into the phone, trying to stay quiet. The operator stayed on the line, reassuring me, telling me help was on the way. The banging stopped suddenly, and in the darkness outside, I thought I saw a shadow slip away down the street. Minutes later, flashing blue and red lights painted the walls inside. The police searched the area but found nothing. No footprints, no suspicious car, no sign of a man. Just a lingering fear that he'd been so close, maybe watching, maybe waiting for the right moment. We stayed at a friend's house that night. I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every leaf brushing against the window outside sent me into a panic. The house, once my sanctuary, had become a trap. The next day, Jenny and I agreed to install cameras and get a security system, but more than that, I realized we had to be somewhere else, at least for a while. The line between safety and danger had blurred, and the person who threatened us was still out there, unseen but palpably near. I didn't know who he was, what he wanted, or why he had fixated on us. But I knew the nightmare was only beginning. Story 2, The Vanished Hourglass. The shift ended just before midnight, and I had that familiar, hollow feeling in my chest as I stepped out of the convenience store and into the chill of the early spring night. The street lamps flickered unevenly along the cracked sidewalk, casting long, wavering shadows beneath the skeletal trees lining Main Street. I zipped my jacket tighter and pulled my collar up against the cold, trying to shake off the exhaustion that settled into my limbs after 10 hours of standing behind the counter, watching people come and go. The road was mostly empty, save for a few cars parked sporadically, their windows fogged up in the cool air. That part of town was quiet at this hour, mostly deserted, save for the night shift workers and the occasional late-night wanderers. I preferred the quiet, but tonight it felt different. Uneasy. The kind of feeling you get when the silence feels too complete, like the world is holding its breath. I checked my phone. No new messages. No missed calls. Just the dull glow of the screen in my palm, casting an unnatural blue light across my face. My ride wasn't due for another 10 minutes, and the bus stop was a couple of blocks down. I debated walking there, but the cold was gnawing through my gloves and I didn't want to hang around outside longer than necessary. I decided to make a quick detour through the small public park that cut the distance in half. It was a narrow strip with a few benches and a playground, fenced off by a low, rusted chain-link barrier. I'd taken this shortcut countless times before, and it always saved me a few minutes. It seemed fine. Familiar. Safe. The grass was slick with dew, and the ground beneath was soft, muffling my footsteps as I made my way through the dimly lit path. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze that had picked up since I left the store. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and something else, something metallic, like old rain on asphalt. I shrugged it off. Probably just a street nearby. Halfway through the park, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, barely visible in the shadow beneath the tallest oak, standing unnaturally still. I froze. My breath hitched. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. Just stood there, like a statue carved out of darkness. I told myself it was probably just someone waiting for a ride or a friend. Maybe a smoker taking a break. But the way they were standing, too still and too quiet, made my skin prickle. I kept walking, trying to act like I hadn't noticed. My footsteps quickened. The figure's head turned slightly, and for a brief second I thought I saw a flash of something in the dim light eyes, maybe? But that could have been my imagination playing tricks. I told myself to calm down, that I was being silly. At the far end of the park, near the exit onto 7th Avenue, I stepped into the brighter glow of a streetlight. The figure was gone. I exhaled a shaky breath and pulled out my phone again, deciding to send a quick text to my sister to let her know I'd be home soon. My fingers fumbled over the screen. That's when I noticed the battery was lower than I'd thought, below 10%, and the signal bars were weak. The little circle on the top right spun endlessly before connecting. I cursed under my breath and hit send anyway. Just as I put the phone away, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. Not hurried like someone running to catch a bus, but measured, like someone pacing to a rhythm only they could hear. I stopped and listened. The footsteps stopped too. I waited, heart pounding, but when I turned around, no one was there. Only the empty path and the swaying branches above, their shadows dancing in the streetlight. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, maybe. A stray animal. That was when a voice, low and gravelly, came from behind me. "Hey!" I jumped, spinning around, but saw no one. My eyes darted from one shadow to the next, searching for the source. "Hey!" The voice was louder this time, closer. More urgent. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I started walking faster toward the street. "I'm just passing through," I said, though my voice was barely steadier than a whisper. "Wait," the voice insisted. I broke into a light jog, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The figure appeared suddenly between two trees. It was a man, late 30s, jeans and a dark jacket. His face was partly hidden by the shadows, but I could make out a few days' worth of stubble and eyes that gleamed weirdly in the lamplight. "Sorry, I don't want any trouble," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just heading home." He took a step closer. "I know you," he said. "You work at the store on Main. I see you all the time." I wanted to talk. I shook my head, heart racing. Everything in me screamed to run, but I was caught on the path with nowhere to hide except back the way I came. I glanced toward the street, only a few cars, none stopping. The bus stop was still a few minutes away. My phone felt useless in my pocket, battery dying, signal weak. "Look, I'm tired. It's late." "I'm not interested," I said, trying to edge past him. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, I'm not going to hurt you." The words sounded hollow, like a bad actor improvising. His smile faded, and his eyes darkened. The air between us thickened, heavier, oppressive. I turned and started running, adrenaline pushing me forward faster than I thought possible. The man called out behind me, but his voice was distant now, swallowed by the night. I burst out of the park onto 7th Avenue, gasping for air. The street was empty, the world suddenly silent except for the pounding of my heart and my ragged breathing. I looked back, but the park entrance was deserted, no sign of him. My phone buzzed. A message from my sister. "Hey, text me when you get home." I typed back, hands trembling, almost there. The bus pulled up moments later, its headlights cutting through the dark. I climbed aboard, sank into a seat by the window, and stared out as the park receded behind us. My reflection in the glass was pale, eyes wide, the stranger's face burned into my mind. I told myself I was safe now. But the feeling didn't leave, the cold knot in my stomach, the prickling at the back of my neck. Safe was just a word, and tonight, it felt like a lie. The bus dropped me off at the edge of town just as the sun was slipping behind the horizon, the sky bruised purple and orange. I had told myself I'd get home early, but the late shift at the hospital had dragged, and the long drive back was more tiring than I expected. Walking from the bus stop to my apartment was only supposed to take 15 minutes, but the widening shadows made every step feel heavier, like the night itself was pressing in. The sidewalk was cracked in places, weeds pushing through the gaps. A few streetlights flickered, some not working at all. There wasn't a soul around except a man sitting on the bench next to the bus shelter. He was bundled in a heavy coat, though it wasn't cold, and his head was bowed low, hands clasped between his knees. I glanced at him, and for a moment he looked up. His eyes were dull but sharp, unsettling in that they seemed to measure me before quickly dropping back to his hands. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking. I kept my phone in my hand, the screen lit with an old playlist, but I didn't press play. The idea of music felt like a distraction I didn't want tonight. Maybe I was on edge from work, or maybe it was just the way the streetlights pulled weak yellow circles onto the pavement, the darkness beyond them so complete that it was like stepping from one island into a black sea. As I walked, I noticed that the man wasn't moving. He stayed on the bench, head down, like he was waiting for something or someone. It felt wrong, but I kept my pace steady, trying not to look back. By the time I reached the next block, he was gone. I felt a small relief but also a flicker of unease. Where had he gone? I scanned the street but there was no sign of him, no sound but the faint hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Turning the corner, I headed down Maple Street, a longer stretch lined with old houses, many abandoned or boarded up. The windows of the ones still lived in glowed warm and safe, but the empty ones felt like dark holes watching me pass. I remembered a friend once told me to avoid this street after dark, but I didn't have much choice. It was the shortest way home. Halfway down Maple, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I didn't turn around, just quickened my pace a little, heart tightening. The footsteps did too, matching my speed, never faltering. I could feel the weight of those steps closing in, like a shadow stretching over me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man about 30 or so, average build, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His face was obscured by the hood, but I caught the flash of his eyes as he looked directly at me. No smile. No greeting. Just watching. I ducked into a small alley between two houses, hoping to lose him. The alley was narrow, the brick walls close enough to reach out and touch on either side. Trash bins and discarded boxes cluttered the path, smells of rot and damp concrete filling the air. I edged forward, trying to keep calm, but the sound of footsteps followed, echoing off the walls. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the ground. I froze not because of the noise, but because the man had stopped just outside the entrance to the alley, his shadow blocking the faint streetlight. I swallowed hard and picked up my phone. I thought about calling 911, but my fingers trembled too much to dial. Instead, I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself he might just be passing by. But then I heard a voice. Low, close. Hey! I snapped my head toward the mouth of the alley. The man's face was still half hidden, but now his eyes glinted in the dark. Are you lost? The question sounded casual, but the tone was sharp, too precise to be accidental. No, I said, voice barely above a whisper. Just heading home. He took a slow step forward, hands slipping into his pockets. It's a long walk alone at night. You sure you don't want some company? I backed up another step, the alley ending behind me in a dead end. My heart hammered so loudly I thought he could hear it. No, thanks. His smile was thin and tight, not reaching his eyes. Suit yourself. He turned and walked away, footsteps fading into the street noise. I didn't move until I was sure he was gone. I made my way out of the alley and hurried down the last few blocks to my apartment. The building's rusty gate squeaked as I pushed it open, and I twisted the key in the lock faster than I had before. Inside, the lobby was dim but familiar, the buzz of the old fluorescent lights overhead making the air feel heavy and still. I pressed the elevator button and waited, watching the cracked glass on the floor tiles, the graffiti scrawled on the walls. When the door slid open, I stepped inside immediately and slammed the button for the third floor. The ride up was slow, every ding adding to the tension coiled tight in my chest. When the doors opened, I bolted down the hall, nearly fumbling with my keys again at the apartment door. Inside, I locked every deadbolt, closed the blinds, and leaned against the door, breathing hard. I checked my phone again, no missed calls, no messages. No sign of anyone. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the man on the bench hours ago was unrelated, and the figure behind me on Maple Street just a stranger out late. But when I looked out the window toward the street, I saw a figure standing across the road, where the streetlights flickered like they might give out any second. The dark shape didn't move, didn't wave, didn't do anything except watch. I blinked, and it was gone. The cold dread wasn't just in my mind anymore. It was real. They were out there, waiting, watching. And I didn't know why. The evening had started like any other Tuesday. I finished my shift at the diner around 10:15 p.m., the usual hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I locked the front door behind me. The air was colder than I expected for late spring, the kind of chill that seemed to settle just under your skin. I pulled my jacket tighter and stepped onto the cracked concrete sidewalk. The streetlights flickered in uneven intervals, casting long, jittery shadows across the empty storefronts. I knew the walk back to my apartment was about 15 minutes if I kept to the main roads. Usually, I didn't mind, the night had a quiet calm, and the occasional dog barking in the distance or the faint rumble of a car made it feel alive in a subtle way. But tonight, something felt off. I shrugged it off as tiredness. After all, the diner's late shift was draining, and started down the road. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from my sister. "Did you get home okay last night?" I frowned. I'd been home all night, and I hadn't told her I was out late. I texted back quickly, "Yeah, all good." "Why?" No response. I slipped the phone back into my jacket pocket and kept walking. The street was emptier than usual. The neighborhood felt quieter than it normally did at this hour, like the usual hum of late-night life had been muted. A few houses to my left had their porch lights off, and the curtains were drawn tight. One house, 2 blocks ahead, had a dim light in the upstairs window. I could just make out the silhouette of a figure standing there, still as a statue. I stopped and stared, my breath fogging in the cold air. It was hard to tell if the figure was looking down the street or not. After a moment, the light went out. I didn't want to dwell on it. Maybe it was just someone up too late, or a reflection of the street lamp. I started up again, trying to keep my steps even, but the sound of my shoes scraping the sidewalk seemed impossibly loud in the silence. As I passed a row of hedges lining a small park, a rustling noise made me freeze. My heart jumped. It was subtle, a faint snapping of twigs, maybe a branch brushing against the leaves. I scanned the shadows between the trees but saw nothing. A stray cat darted out from the bushes and disappeared down an alley. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to keep moving. About halfway home, the street narrowed and the trees leaned in closer. The streetlights became sparser here, and the shadows thickened. I noticed a car parked on the side of the road, an old sedan with peeling paint. It had been there for a while, probably belonging to someone visiting the neighborhood. What struck me was the driver's side window, rolled down just a crack. The inside was dark, but a faint movement caught my eye, a man shifting in his seat. I hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was nearby. The houses here were mostly empty at this hour. The silence felt oppressive. I was suddenly very aware of my breathing, too loud, too ragged, and the way my fingers tightened around the strap of my bag. I started walking faster, keeping my gaze fixed ahead. Then, from behind me, a car engine rumbled to life. I turned briefly. The old sedan was pulling away slowly, tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As the car crept past, I caught a glimpse of the driver's face in the dim streetlight, sharp features, dark eyes that didn't avoid mine. I walked the last few blocks home with my heart pounding. The porch light was off when I reached my building, which surprised me. I was sure I'd turned it on before I left that morning. I fumbled in my pocket for the key and noticed my hands were trembling. The doorknob was cold and rough under my skin. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lobby was dark, the overhead bulb flickering weakly. I pressed the button for my floor and leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breath. The elevator dinged, and I stepped inside. As the doors slid shut, I glanced around. No one else was there. On the 5th floor, I hurried down the hallway, keys in hand. My apartment door was closed, but the lock felt loose when I turned it. I frowned and pushed the door open slowly. The hallway light inside was off. I called out, "Hello," but the only reply was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I flipped the switch. The room was just as I'd left it, clothes folded on the couch, a mug on the kitchen counter. Nothing seemed disturbed. Still, a tight knot formed in my stomach. I locked the door behind me and went to the window. The street was empty, the only light coming from a flickering neon sign across the road. I pulled the curtains tight and checked the peephole. The old sedan was gone. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands still shaking slightly. The silence was heavy, but for the first time, it felt safer than the street outside. I glanced at my phone again. This time, a new message popped up from an unknown number, "Nice night for a walk." I stared at the screen, the message making the hair on my arms stand up. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't know what to say. Who was this? How did they get my number? And why did it feel like the night had just gotten a lot worse? I locked the phone and put it face down. The night was far from over. I told myself there was no reason to panic. The bus was late, the streetlights flickered sometimes, and people did stare. It didn't mean anything, not really. I had been waiting outside the old grocery store on 27th Street for nearly 40 minutes, the evening chill settling into my joints. I wrapped my arms tighter around my thin jacket, trying to away the creeping unease that had been building since I left work. The late shift always made me edgy, but tonight something felt off, like the air itself was heavier. The bus was supposed to arrive at 7:15, and it was now past 7:50. The street was oddly quiet for this part of town. Usually, there was a steady trickle of cars, the shuffle of feet on cracked sidewalks, the shrill bark of some late-night dog. Tonight, only the muted hum of distant traffic punctuated the silence. The dim orange glow of the street lamps cast long shadows across the vacant lot adjacent to the store, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. A man had been standing across the street when I arrived. He was leaning against a lamppost, head down, fingers tapping on his phone. At first, I thought nothing of it. Plenty of people hung out here, homeless, were just passing time. But after some time, I realized he hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. His phone screen was the only thing lighting his face, making his pale eyes glint in the dark. I tried not to stare, but something about the stillness was unnerving. I glanced back at the store's boarded-up entrance. The windows were clouded with grime, and the faded out-of-business sign hung askew. It had been abandoned for over a year, but this was the only bus stop for blocks. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. My phone buzzed in my pocket, no signal. Of course. I had forgotten that part of town was a dead zone for reception. The man had moved now. He was crossing the street toward the bus stop. His steps were slow, deliberate, the cracks in the pavement echoing faintly in the stillness. I felt my stomach knot. I tried to convince myself it was just coincidence, that people walked where they wanted. But my pulse quickened. As he got closer, I noticed his clothes, an unbuttoned flannel shirt over a plain white tee, dark jeans, nothing remarkable. But his eyes were locked on me now. I could feel the weight of that gaze, sharp and unblinking. His face was expressionless, almost blank, but the intensity was unmistakable. A sudden breeze rattled the dry leaves scattered around my feet. I swallowed hard. The bus stop bench creaked as I sat down, pulling my jacket closer. The man stopped a few feet away, standing just beyond the puddle of light under the street lamp. I tried to look casual, letting my hands rest on my lap, fingers tapping nervously. Minutes passed with no word. The silence was oppressive. I could hear my own breathing, uneven and shallow. The man's eyes never left me. I wondered what he was thinking. Was he waiting for the bus too? Or was he waiting for me? A car passed slowly down the street, headlights briefly illuminating us both. The man lifted his head slightly, watching the car disappear. Then his gaze returned to me. I wanted to ask if there was a problem, but the words caught in my throat. The bus still didn't come. A sudden movement from behind made me jump. A cat darted out from under the store's overhang, weaving through the weeds. I forced a laugh, telling myself I was overreacting. But the feeling of being watched intensified. The man shifted his weight, taking a step closer. Waiting for the bus? His voice was low, casual, but there was an edge I couldn't place. "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone steady. "It's late." He nodded. "Usually comes on time, huh?" I forced a tight smile. "Apparently not tonight." He glanced past me, toward the dark street that stretched into the distance. "You live around here?" "Not far," I said, hoping to keep things neutral. "Alone?" His next question caught me off guard. I hesitated. "Yeah." "Why?" "No reason," he said quickly, then added, "just making conversation." The smile didn't reach his eyes. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. I stood up abruptly. "I think the bus is just really late." He didn't move. "You okay?" There was an attempt at concern in his voice, but it felt forced. I tried to sound firmer. "Yeah, I'm fine." The streetlight above us flickered and buzzed. I took a step back, my eyes scanning the shadows beyond the light's reach. The man's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted, a slight bend in his knees as if preparing to move. A sudden, sharp noise from the alley next to the store, a trash can tipping over, made me flinch. The man's head snapped toward the sound. Then he looked back at me, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like someone's out tonight," he said. I nodded, backing toward the main sidewalk, my heart hammering in my chest. The bus stop didn't feel like a waiting area anymore, it felt like a trap. Just then, headlights swept down the street. A city bus rounded the corner, lights glowing bright against the dark. Relief flooded me. The man took a step back, fading into the shadow of the building. I climbed onto the bus, choosing a seat near the front. The driver gave me a quick nod, eyes sharp. I pulled my jacket tighter and stared out the window as we pulled away. When I glanced back, the man was gone. For a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. But the unease didn't leave. The way he had watched me, the questions he asked, they were small details, but they gnawed at me. I hadn't seen him get on the bus. Had he followed me? Was he waiting somewhere down the line? The city buzzed around me, passengers talking softly, the bus engine humming. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still not safe. That the night was far from over. The evening had started out like any other Thursday. I was finishing a late shift at the diner on Elm Street, wiping down the counter and stacking chairs. The bell above the door jingled one last time as the last customer left, and I locked up, tucking the keys into my pocket. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a thin strip of orange fading into dark blue. The streetlights flickered on in a lazy rhythm, the occasional car humming past on the wet asphalt. I didn't think much of the walk home. It was about a mile, nothing unusual, and I'd done it dozens of times before. The night was cool but not cold. I wore a light jacket, hands stuffed into the pockets. The houses on my street sat close together, their windows dim, some with soft glows from lamps, others completely dark. I pulled my scarf up a little higher, listening to the faint sound of my footsteps and the whistle of a distant train. About halfway there, I noticed a man standing on the corner near the old gas station. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up despite the mild weather, and loose jeans. His posture was slouched, hands in his pockets like he was trying to be invisible. I'd seen him before, I realized with a chill, though I couldn't place exactly where. He didn't look around, didn't move when I passed, just stood there like a statue. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder. He was still there, unmoving, watching. It was the first time I felt the slow, crawling prick of unease knotting in my stomach. Not quite fear yet, just that warning feeling you get when something feels off, even if you can't say why. I tried to shake it off as I turned the corner toward my street. The houses blurred past, familiar but suddenly too quiet. No cars on the road now, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, no notifications. I slipped it back in and kept walking. When I reached the driveway of my house, I paused, fumbling with my keys. That's when I noticed the footprints in the damp dirt beside the sidewalk. They were fresh, too fresh, and they led straight toward my front door. My breath hitched. The rain from earlier had stopped hours ago. How had someone left prints that clear now? I scanned the street quickly, heart jittery, but no one was around. Unlocking the door felt sticky, like the lock was catching on something. It was late, and I had been tired all day. Maybe I was imagining things. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, locking it behind me. The house smelled like stale coffee and lemon cleaner. I flicked on the lights, checking the rooms quickly: living room, kitchen, bathroom. Nothing out of place. Still, I closed the blinds and locked the windows, double-checking the deadbolt on the back door. I sat down heavily on the couch and tried to calm down. Maybe I was just jumpy. The man on the corner could have been waiting for a ride or someone else. The footprints could have been left by a neighbor's kid coming home late. My mind raced through explanations as I tried to steady my breathing. Then my phone buzzed again. I pulled it out, heart skipping. A new text. No name, just a number I didn't recognize. Why didn't you say hi? A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I stared at the message, heart pounding so hard I thought I might hear it in my ears. I didn't reply. I almost didn't want to look, but curiosity won. Another message came through a minute later. I saw you. I was there. I didn't know what to do. Call the police. Would they believe me? Was it someone I knew? Someone I didn't? The idea that someone had been watching me all day, or even just since I left work, felt suffocating. I was suddenly aware of every sound: the ticking of the clock, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards under the house settling. I shut the phone off and slipped it under the couch cushion. It felt safer that way, at least for now. Then a noise came from the kitchen. It was soft, almost a whisper, but my eyes snapped toward the doorway. I held my breath. Nothing. I got up and walked cautiously to the kitchen, flipping the light on. The room was empty. The window was closed. The knife block sat where I always kept it. I exhaled slowly. Maybe it was the house settling again. Maybe it was an animal outside. I tried to convince myself to go back to bed. But as I reached for the door to my bedroom, something caught my eye. On the kitchen counter, a single key lay gleaming under the light, one I didn't recognize. My heart slammed in my chest. I sank to the floor, clutching the key, my hands trembling. I hadn't seen it before. Had someone been here? Someone who left the footprints outside. Someone who'd watched me from the corner. I grabbed my phone again, turned it on, and dialed 911. My voice was low and shaky, almost a whisper, as I explained the situation. The operator assured me help was on the way. I locked myself in my bedroom, bolted the door, and sat on the floor, staring at the door handle, listening. Minutes felt like hours. The sound of sirens finally pierced the night far off in the distance. I opened the door a crack and called out, voice raw, "It's me. The police are coming." The footsteps I'd been imagining since the kitchen noise never came. When the officers arrived, I showed them the key and the footprints. They searched the house and yard but found nothing else. No sign of forced entry. No sign anyone else had been inside, except for the key that nobody could identify. One officer suggested it might be a prank or someone trying to scare me, but neither of them seemed fully convinced. They promised to keep an eye on the area and left me with a warning to be cautious. I sat back down on my bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. The key still cold in my hand, a reminder that someone had been close enough to touch my life without me even knowing it, and they could come back any time. Outside, the night was still. But I wasn't. I was wide awake, trapped inside my own house with the knowledge that whatever had been there wasn't finished yet. Story 3, Mirrorless Reflections, the perfect replacement. I never thought I'd feel unsafe in my own neighborhood. It was the kind of place where kids still played outside until dark, and neighbors waved at each other over their hedges like in a movie. Quiet streets lined with apple trees and the faint hum of lawnmowers on weekend mornings. My little apartment was on the edge of town, a block away from the woods, and I liked it that way, close enough for a quick hike but far enough from the chaos downtown. That Thursday started just like any other. I got home around 6, the sky a dull gray that promised rain but hadn't spilled yet. The bus stop was usually packed with people coming from work, but that day it was nearly empty. I noticed a man standing there alone, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a long, dark coat, though it wasn't cold. His face was obscured by the shadow of a baseball cap, and he didn't look like he was waiting for the bus. More like watching. I slowed down when I passed, trying to catch a better look. He shifted his weight, glanced toward me as if thinking better of something, then turned and walked away down the street. It was odd, but I didn't want to make a scene. Everyone around here had their quirks. I told myself I was overthinking it. Inside the apartment, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and the faint, lingering smell of last night's dinner. I flicked on the kettle and pulled out my laptop to check emails. That's when my phone buzzed a text from an unknown number. I unlocked it, expecting some wrong number or spam. See you tonight. No name. No punctuation. Just that one line. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I thought about blocking the number, but I was too rattled to do anything immediately. I stared at the screen, trying to figure out if I knew anyone who might be playing some sort of joke. Nobody in my circle was that cruel. I told myself it was probably a prank, maybe a leftover message from a wrong number that had just hit my phone late. Still, that feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. I locked the door behind me twice, checked the windows, even peered out the peephole a few times. Nothing but the usual quiet street, a couple of cars parked unevenly along the curb, and the old oak tree swaying in the wind. Later, as I was cooking dinner, I noticed the streetlight outside flicker on earlier than usual. Outside, the man from the bus stop was back, leaning against the cracked brick wall of the corner store across the street. His coat looked heavier somehow, the collar pulled up. He wasn't looking my way, but I could see his head turn as I moved by the window. I moved away quickly, heart pounding, and tried to focus on stirring the sauce. I kept the curtains closed for the rest of the night. Every time I thought I heard a noise outside, footsteps crunching on gravel, the scrape of a metal bin against the pavement, I'd hold my breath and tell myself it was just the neighborhood settling. Around 10, I decided to check my messages again. Another text. Don't ignore me. I felt my hands go clammy. The message was sent just minutes ago. I debated calling the police but didn't want to seem paranoid, and there was no direct threat. Just enough to make me uneasy. I locked the deadbolt again and sat on the couch, phone in hand, waiting for something to happen or someone to call me with an explanation. Minutes stretched into an hour, the silence between messages heavier than any noise. I checked every window and door one more time before shutting the lights off. I was about to crawl into bed when I thought I heard a soft knock at the front door. My breath caught in my throat. Knock. Knock. Not hard, like someone testing, but deliberate. I didn't move. The knocking stopped. I strained to listen. Nothing. I told myself it was a mistake, maybe someone at the wrong door. But then the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow, careful, made my body freeze. Each footfall pressed like a weight on my chest. I wanted to scream or run, but I was rooted to the spot. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded away, retreating down the sidewalk. I didn't breathe until the sound was gone completely. The door was still locked tight. I spent the rest of the night awake, unable to shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment. The text stopped after midnight, but the fear didn't. Morning came with a thick fog that muffled the street sounds and blurred my vision. I didn't sleep much. When I finally forced myself to step outside, the corner store was open, the man nowhere in sight. But on the cracked pavement near the entrance, I saw 3 small, scuffed footprints leading toward the edge of the woods. I didn't want to know what they meant, but the weight in my stomach told me this was just the beginning. I followed the footprints cautiously, the fog curling around my ankles like cold fingers. They vanished abruptly beneath the gnarled roots at the forest's edge, swallowed by shadows thicker than the mist. An uneasy chill crept down my spine as I realized the woods seemed unnaturally silent, as if holding its breath. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "Don't go further," but I couldn't turn back. Not yet. The rain had started again by the time I left the diner. It was one of those cold, relentless drizzles that clung to your clothes and never seemed to stop, turning the streets slick and the night even darker. My shift had ended nearly 2 hours earlier, but I had stayed late, hoping to get a head start on the paperwork. The owners were usually fine with that, as long as I didn't complain about the late hours. Outside, the parking lot was almost empty except for a few cars scattered under the weak glow of the street lamps. I pulled my head up, the fabric damp and heavy, and headed to my car, which was parked at the far end near the cracked sidewalk. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, a sharp contrast to the steady patter of rain. I glanced around, but the street was deserted, no one walking, no cars passing. Just the sound of water running into gutters and the distant rumble of thunder. I felt a flicker of unease, the kind that settles in your stomach without a reason you can point to. Maybe it was the way the light flickered in a street lamp above the lot, sputtering like it might go out any second. Or the way the shadows seemed to shift just a little too quickly at the edges of my vision. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, tiredness from the long shift, but the feeling stuck like a weight. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, the smell of damp leather and old fast food wrappers hitting me immediately. As I started the engine, I noticed movement in the rearview mirror, just a flicker, barely there. I turned my head quickly, but the empty parking lot showed no one. Still, the sensation lingered, a cold prickling down my spine. The drive home was supposed to be quick. The highway wasn't far, and it was mostly straight. But tonight, something about the road felt different. The rain blurred the streetlights into long, streaked halos, and the windshield wipers barely kept up. I kept the headlights on low so I wouldn't blind oncoming traffic and stayed alert, glancing at the rearview mirror every few seconds. About 10 minutes in, I noticed a car behind me. It was an older model sedan, one I'd seen around town but never paid much attention to. What unsettled me was how close it was, even though I was going the speed limit. It didn't flash its lights or honk, just stayed there, tailing me steadily. I tried not to panic. Maybe it was just coincidence, someone heading the same way. I took the next exit, a small turn off the highway that led to a narrow, two-lane road lined with dense woods. The kind of place where the streetlights thinned out and darkness swallowed everything beyond the edge of the asphalt. The car behind me followed, its headlights a dull glow cutting through the rain. I thought about pulling over somewhere safe, a gas station or a well-lit parking lot, but the next closest place was miles ahead. Instead, I kept driving, hoping to lose the car by varying my speed. I slowed down, then sped up, took 2 quick turns in a row, and still, the sedan stayed behind. A knot tightened in my chest. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles whitened. The only sound inside the car was the steady shush of the wipers and the distant drone of the engine. Behind me, the sedan's lights flickered on a wet patch of road, occasionally disappearing behind trees that leaned close to the roadside. Suddenly, at a curve where the road bent sharply to the right, the car behind me flashed its high beams twice in quick succession. My heart leapt. Was it trying to signal me? Or warn me? Or was it some kind of game? I swallowed hard and kept my eyes on the road, not looking back. I thought about calling the police but hesitated. What would I say? That a car was driving behind me too closely? That I felt uneasy? I didn't even know if this was a deliberate threat or just someone being careless. The road soon narrowed into a single lane, flanked by tall pines that blocked out the remaining light from the sky. The rain was heavier here, hammering on the roof of the car, muffling everything else. I noticed the other car's lights swinging erratically, like it was having trouble following the road. Maybe the driver was distracted or drunk. The idea made the situation feel even more dangerous. I spotted a dirt driveway on the right, nearly hidden behind overgrown bushes. A faded mailbox leaned crookedly at its edge. Without thinking, I turned into it, the car sliding slightly on the loose gravel. The sedan passed the turnoff without slowing down. I cut the engine and sat still, listening. The downpour covered a lot of noise, but I thought I heard the distant sound of an engine idling. I kept the headlights off, fingers trembling as I reached over to lock the doors again. Minutes passed, maybe more. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, straining to see through the rain and darkness. The sedan was nowhere in sight. Relief washed over me in waves, but it was fragile, like the calm before a storm. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I had to find a way home, but the road felt impossibly long and empty tonight. The woods around me seemed to press closer, every shadow suddenly alive. Then, when I finally dared to start the engine again, I heard a faint tapping at the driver's side window. My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned my head. There was no one there. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself it was just rain hitting the glass or a loose branch scraping against the car. When I looked again, the tapping had stopped. I forced myself to drive back onto the road, my senses on high alert. The sedan had disappeared for good. But something had changed. The quiet weight of being watched settled over me, and the night no longer felt empty, it felt full of eyes I couldn't see. I made it home without incident, but I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by the streetlight outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept checking the locks, peering out the window. Whether or not the sedan was just a coincidence, I knew that something had followed me. And I had no idea what it wanted. The shift ended at 11:30 p.m., just as it always did, and I was ready to escape the cramped hospital break room that smelled vaguely of antiseptic and stale coffee. I grabbed my jacket off the hook by the door, the fabric still warm from hanging near the radiator, and stepped out into the night. It was early March, but the cold still lingered, biting through my coat as I made my way to the parking lot. The hospital was in a quiet part of town, surrounded mostly by empty lots and a few shuttered storefronts. The streetlights cast pools of yellow that barely reached the edges of the asphalt, and the occasional car passed through, its headlights briefly blinding. I unlocked my car and slid inside, the interior light flickering on with a soft hum. The heater sputtered a little as I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine caught with a low rumble that quickly settled into a steady purr. The radio was dead, thanks to a blown fuse I hadn't gotten around to fixing, so the silence inside the car pressed in on me. I pulled out of the lot and headed toward the highway, the road stretching ahead like a ribbon of black glass, slick from an earlier rain. The drive wasn't long, about 20 minutes through stretches of empty roads lined with scattered houses and dense clusters of trees. I kept my eyes on the road, watching for deer or other animals. The dark outside made everything look a little sharper, the headlights carving through the shadows. I felt tired, but I welcomed the quiet. It was the one time I could be alone with my thoughts. About halfway home, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down, no notifications. Then it buzzed again. I pulled over onto the shoulder, hands shaking slightly. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Are you alone?" I frowned, fingers hesitating over the screen. My heart picked up speed for no good reason. I typed back, "Who's this?" No reply. I locked the phone and tucked it away. Maybe a prank, I told myself. But the unease didn't fade. I started driving again, but soon after, the headlights of a car appeared in my rearview mirror, bright and persistent. At first, I thought it was just someone else heading home. But as the minutes passed, the car stayed behind me, matching my speed exactly. I tried varying my pace, slowing down, speeding up, but the headlights stayed glued to me like a shadow. I took the next exit, weaving through side streets that I knew well. The other car followed. My stomach tightened. I pulled into a 24-hour convenience store parking lot, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and casting harsh, flickering light on cracked asphalt. The other car stopped across the lot, its engine rumbling faintly. I sat in my car, doors locked, windows up, heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst through my chest. I debated calling the police but hesitated. What if it was nothing? I told myself to stay calm, rational. I watched as the other car's driver's side door opened, then shut. The figure moved around the car, pacing slowly, like they were waiting for something or someone. I couldn't see their face clearly, but their posture was tense, deliberate. After a few minutes, I started my engine again and pulled back onto the road, trying to stay calm. The car followed. I tried to remember if I'd made any enemies recently. Nothing came to mind. No fights, no weird incidents at work. Just the usual grind. I took a sharp turn onto a road I rarely used, a route that snaked through a stretch of woods and small farms. The trees pressed in on both sides, like tall, pale sentries in the night. The other car followed obediently, like it was baited. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white. I thought about driving to the police station, but it was on the far side of town, a longer detour. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call. Unknown number. I didn't answer. Then the car behind me flashed its high beams. I slammed on the brakes. The car behind me did the same, skidding slightly in the gravel shoulder. I couldn't see the face of the driver, but the silhouette was unmistakably human, rigid and looming. For a moment, we just sat there, the engines idling, breathing in the cold, still air. Then the driver's door opened. I locked my doors and pressed my foot against the gas, peeling away and speeding up the road as fast as I dared, heart hammering in my throat. The other car remained on the shoulder, the figure standing still in the beams of its own headlights. I leaned back in my seat, trying to steady my breathing. I felt frozen, like I was caught in a nightmare I couldn't escape from. The woods thinned as I neared the edge of town. The roads grew brighter. I pulled into a well-lit gas station, the fluorescent lights harsh but comforting after the dark woods. Inside, I barely registered the cashier's casual nod. I filled my tank, scanning the lot nervously through the glass doors. No sign of the car. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and stepped outside, locking my doors tightly behind me. The night felt heavy still, but for now, I was safe. Still, as I got back into my car and started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been following me wasn't done yet. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when I pulled into the small parking lot behind the grocery store. It was the kind of place that felt almost abandoned by 7 p.m., even on a Friday. A few cars scattered here and there, the fluorescent lights and the occasional clatter from the stores inside. I locked the car, grabbed my cloth tote bag, and walked toward the entrance. My hands still trembled a little from the jerking stop I'd made on the highway earlier, heart pounding like it was trying to get out of my chest. But I told myself I was just tired, and maybe a little jumpy from the long day at work. The automatic doors slid open with their usual whoosh. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of bleach and fresh produce, the quiet murmur of a few other shoppers drifting from the aisles. I started down the frozen foods aisle, picking up a couple of bags of vegetables, when I noticed a man standing at the end, by the dairy section. He was tall, thin, wearing a navy jacket zipped all the way up though it wasn't cold inside, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Something about the way he stood there, just watching, made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself he was just waiting for someone, or maybe looking for a product, but his gaze didn't waver. It felt deliberate. I shifted my weight and turned my head slightly, but when I glanced back, he was gone. I breathed out slowly, telling myself he had moved on, maybe to the checkout line. Still, I kept my pace steady, trying to focus on the list in my head. Milk, eggs, bread, routine stuff. The store wasn't very busy, but I noticed an older woman near the checkout with wide, darting eyes, clutching her purse like it might jump away. The cashier, a young guy with a name tag that read Eli, kept glancing nervously toward the front doors. When I reached the produce aisle, I heard footsteps behind me on the linoleum floor, slow and steady. I looked over my shoulder. The same man from before was there again, just a few feet behind. He hadn't yet reached for anything on the shelves. Instead, his eyes followed my every move. That familiar pounding in my chest returned, and my fingers curled tighter around the handle of my tote. I stopped, pretending to examine a bunch of bananas, but I could feel him waiting, like a cat watching a mouse. I debated turning and walking straight to the exit, but I'd left my car keys in my pocket, and I didn't want to cause a scene, not yet. The man took a single step closer. I swallowed hard, the taste of dryness filling my mouth. His voice was low and gravelly when he finally spoke. "You live around here?" I forced a smile, the kind that said nothing. "Yeah, just down the street." He nodded slowly, eyes never leaving mine. "You get off work late, huh?" "Not many people here at this hour." My stomach twisted. "Yeah. Long shift." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then glanced around as if checking for witnesses. "You walk home alone?" "Usually," I replied, trying to sound casual. He grinned, a quick flash of teeth that didn't reach his eyes. "That's brave." I kept my voice steady though my hands itched to reach for my phone. Or maybe just stupid. The man chuckled, but it was a dry, humorless sound. "Don't worry. I'm not here to cause trouble." Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed near the back of the store. The woman at the checkout gasped, and Eli bolted from behind the counter, shouting something I couldn't quite catch. The man turned his head sharply toward the noise, and I took the chance to slip past him and head for the exit. As I pushed through the doors, the cool air hit my face like a slap. I glanced back and saw store employees rushing toward the source of the noise. The storage room door had been forced open, the lock dangling. I didn't wait. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my apartment's security company. My fingers trembled so badly I had to try twice. The operator's voice was calm but clipped. "Your system shows all sensors normal, ma'am. Did you want to request a patrol?" I hesitated. The man from the store was nowhere in sight, and the employees had locked the door behind them. I told the operator yes, and hung up without waiting for confirmation. Walking back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, heart hammering like a drum. The parking lot was emptier now, the few remaining cars casting long shadows in the fading light. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out, I caught a glimpse of the man from the store standing at the edge of the lot, watching. He didn't move as I drove away. The streetlights flickered on as night fell, their weak glow barely lighting the cracked pavement. I kept my windows rolled up and the doors locked tight, I starting to every darkened side street I passed. The radio played static, the signal weak as I moved further from the grocery store. I told myself it was just a coincidence, just a strange encounter I'd chalk up to stress and exhaustion. But as I turned onto the highway ramp, my headlights illuminated a figure standing on the shoulder about 100 yards behind me. He wasn't waving or signaling for help. Just standing there, motionless, hands in his jacket pockets. I slammed on the accelerator and shifted lanes, heart racing so fast I thought I might black out. When I glanced in the rearview mirror again, the figure was gone. I didn't stop again until I pulled into my apartment complex's parking lot, headlights catching the familiar orange glow of the street lamps. I parked under the nearest light, grabbed my keys, and walked quickly to the door. Behind me, the parking lot was empty, silence pressing in from all sides. Inside, I locked every door and window, double-checked the chain lock, and slid the deadbolt home. I leaned against the door, breathing hard, the faint hum of the hallway light buzzing overhead. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a message from my neighbor. "Did you hear about the break-in last week? They still haven't found the guy." I stared at the screen, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Whatever was happening wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The street was quieter than usual when I stepped out of the coffee shop just after midnight. I had taken the late shift at the diner downtown, a 12-hour slog that left me too drained to think straight, and I was ready to get home, crawl into bed, and forget the day ever happened. It was supposed to be a routine walk back to my apartment, just 3 blocks away, but the air tasted off, like the city had been holding its breath and forgotten to exhale. I zipped up my jacket tighter, the October chill slicing through the night. The streetlights flickered unevenly, one of them buzzing low before cutting out entirely, plunging a portion of the sidewalk into shadow. I crossed the road, my boots tapping against the cracked pavement, and glanced over my shoulder. A man on a bike was half a block behind me, riding slowly, almost aimlessly. Nothing unusual, lots of people rode late. But something about him unsettled me. He wore a dark hood pulled low, obscuring his face, and as he passed a street lamp, I caught the glint of something reflective on his wrist, maybe a watch or a bracelet. I increased my pace. The man did the same, though he didn't speed up, just matched my steps. I told myself it was paranoia, after the story I'd read earlier about strangers following women home, but it gnawed at the edge of my nerves anyway. I turned right at the corner, moving into a narrower street lined with old row houses, their windows mostly dark except for the occasional flicker of a TV or the glow of a night light. The man followed, fearing left to cut me off. I stopped at the street lamp and looked back. He did too, now only about 20 feet behind me, his bike leaning slightly to one side. My hands tightened into fists. The colder night air made my breath visible, puffing out in short bursts. I debated running, but the street twisted ahead, and running blindly down a side alley didn't seem like a smart choice. Instead, I took out my phone and flipped it open, the soft light illuminating my face. I dialed my roommate's number quietly, hoping she'd answer. The line rang twice before going to voicemail. I sent a quick text with my location. Walking home, feel like I'm being followed. No response. I started walking again, this time deliberately slower, trying not to look over my shoulder too often, but the weight of his presence behind me was like a shadow I couldn't shake. The street lamp buzzed again and died, and now the path was darker except for the faint glow from a 24-hour convenience store up ahead. Relief prickled at me, like reaching a beacon. I quickened my steps. But then I heard the bike's tires crunch on gravel, the subtle scrape of rubber against stone, closer than before. I stopped abruptly, heart hammering in my chest. From the dark, a voice called out softly, "Hey, are you okay?" It wasn't threatening or harsh, just low and a bit rough. I froze, debating how to respond. Something about the tone was off, too casual, too rehearsed. I kept my phone in my hand, ready to call emergency services if needed. "Yeah," I said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Just heading home." The man slowed to a stop a few feet away, the bike leaning against a tree. I could finally make out his features in the weak light, a young guy, maybe mid-20s, scruffy beard, tired eyes. His jacket was oversized, hanging off his frame. There was a nervous twitch in his jaw. "You looked scared," he said, stepping closer. "Didn't mean to freak you out. I live 4 blocks that way. Saw you walking and thought I'd check in." My mind scrambled. That explanation didn't quite fit the slow tailing, the silence, the sudden approach. But maybe I was just jumpy. Maybe it was nothing. "I'm fine," I said, trying to sound firm. "Thanks." He smiled awkwardly, but there was a tension in it, like he wasn't used to being turned down or ignored. "Okay," he said. "Be safe." "Yeah." I nodded and started walking again, glancing back once more. He got on his bike and rode off, disappearing into the gloom. I exhaled, trying to shake the prickling fear that lingered in my skin. The convenience store was just ahead, its fluorescent lights buzzing inside. The door chimed softly as I pushed through, a bell that always felt like a small shield against the night's dangers. Inside, I grabbed a bottle of water and a granola bar, telling the clerk I was just passing through. The air smelled of stale coffee and cardboard boxes. I stood near the cashier, phone pressed to my ear again, but no answer. After 10 minutes, I decided to try calling my roommate once more. This time, she picked up. "Hey," I whispered. "Where are you?" she asked, voice groggy but alert. "By the 24-hour store on Maple." I think someone was following me. There was a pause on the other end, then, "I'm coming out now." "Wait there." I hung up, feeling a flicker of gratitude, but my nerves were raw and stretched thin. I kept scanning the dark street through the large windows, every shadow making my heart leap. Minutes later, my roommate appeared, flashlight in hand, eyes sharp and scanning the surroundings. Relief flooded me as she slipped her arm around my shoulders. "Let's get out of here," she said quietly. We walked back the way I had come, but the street felt different now, empty and colder, the quiet ringing louder. As we reached the corner where I had first noticed a man on the bike, my eyes caught something on the pavement. A small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, It was a scrap torn from a notebook, with 2 words scrawled hastily, "Nice try." My throat tightened. It wasn't a joke, it wasn't a mistake. Someone had been watching me long before tonight, following me, playing a game I hadn't even realized I was a part of. We hurried the last few blocks home, checking behind and around us every few steps, adrenaline sharp in my veins. Inside the safety of my apartment, I locked every door and window, double-checking the deadbolt. The normal sounds of the city seemed distant now, muted by the weight of what had just happened. I sat on the edge of the couch, phone in hand, fingers trembling. The man on the bike was real. The note was real. And I had no idea what would come next. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't safe. Not anymore. Story 4, Silent Protocol, When Home Turns Hostile. I hadn't intended to be out that late on a Tuesday, but the meeting at work ran longer than expected. The fluorescent lights in the conference room buzzed insistently, and my phone's battery was already hovering dangerously below 10% when I finally shut the laptop. I glanced at the clock, 9:43 p.m. Not late by most people's standards, but late enough for the streets to empty and for the city's quieter, darker side to show itself in thin slivers between the street lamps. My office was on the 15th floor of a glass tower downtown, too high to see much beyond the rings of lights from other buildings, but the elevator ride down was always a small relief. I pushed the button and slipped inside, pressing the ground floor with a tired thumb. The doors closed with a soft hiss, and I could hear the faint thump of my shoes against the tile flooring as the elevator descended. When the doors opened, the lobby was nearly empty, just one security guard sitting behind the desk, his eyes glued to the screen of a handheld game. He glanced up, caught my tired nod, and went back to his game without a word. The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing me into the crisp night air. I had parked on the 3rd level of the underground garage, and the walk from the elevator was always a bit eerie after dark. The long concrete corridors were lit by sparse, flickering fluorescent bulbs, throwing harsh shadows against the walls. Tonight, the usual hum of distant engines and muffled conversations was missing. Instead, a silence had settled over the space, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a cracked pipe overhead. As I made my way to my car, I noticed something odd. A man was standing near the far end of the garage, close to the stairwell exit. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I hadn't noticed him when I took the elevator down, but now that I saw him, he seemed out of place. His posture was rigid, almost stiff, as if he were waiting for something or someone. I tried to ignore him. I kept my pace steady, keys clenched tightly in my hand, ready to unlock the car. The fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow. The man didn't move as I approached, but neither did he look away. I caught a glimpse of his face, sharp features, pale skin, but the shadows obscured most of it. My heart quickened. Ordinarily, I wasn't jumpy, but something about the stillness of that space, combined with the man's unwavering gaze, made me uncomfortable. I unlocked the door and slipped inside, locking it immediately behind me. The silence inside the car felt safer somehow, cocooned in steel and glass. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the sudden spike of dread. The engine started smoothly, and I pulled out of the parking spot, careful not to glance back at the stairwell where the man had stood. When I reached the ramp to exit the garage, I noticed a small piece of paper stuck beneath my windshield wiper. My fingers trembled slightly as I peeled it off. The note was typed, not handwritten, and the message was brief. "I saw you." A slow wave of nausea rolled through me. I looked around the garage. No one else was visible. The man was gone. I locked the car doors again and stared at the note, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing in from all directions. My fingers hovered over the lock button on the remote. Should I call security? The police? What if this was some sick joke? Or worse, the beginning of something I wasn't prepared to face. I shoved the note into my pocket and focused on leaving. The drive out of the garage was tight and twisting, the concrete walls close enough to make the car feel like a cage. At the exit, the bright streetlights seemed colder than usual, the night wind sharper. As I merged onto the road, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, telling myself it was just someone's idea of a prank. But even when I hit the highway and the city lights blurred past, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror. A car followed me. It was a dark sedan, matching my speed exactly. Every time I changed lanes, it changed lanes too. Every time I slowed for a red light or a turn, it slowed. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I tried to remain calm, signaling an unexpected right turn onto a less busy street, hoping to lose whoever was behind me. The sedan followed. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles whitened. I avoided well-lit areas, slipping into side streets, hoping to catch a familiar landmark or at least some sign of other pedestrians. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I dared not check it. The battery was almost dead, and more importantly, I couldn't risk taking my eyes off the road. Eventually, I turned into a gas station parking lot, bright and crowded enough that the sedan hesitated and slowed, lurking near the exit. I parked near the lights, locking the doors immediately, and pulled my phone out. With less than 5% battery left, I called my sister, hoping for a voice, a familiar sound that might keep me grounded. Her voice on the line was a small bomb, but my eyes never stopped scanning the station's perimeter. The sedan was still there, engine idling, the driver's window rolled down a crack I could barely make out. I couldn't see the driver's face, but the car's position told me he or she was waiting. I told my sister I'd be home soon and to call the police if I didn't check in. The words felt feeble even as I said them. I sat there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 15 minutes, until the sedan finally pulled away. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to start the car and drive the rest of the way home, heart hammering against my ribs with every turn, every shadow. When I finally unlocked my front door, the house was silent, the familiar creaks and groans of the settling went unchanged. I locked every door and window, double-checked the deadbolt, and sat on the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The note. The man in the garage. The car following me. None of it felt like coincidence. Someone had been watching me, tracking me. And I had no idea why. I tried to convince myself it was over. Maybe the driver had given up. Maybe it had been a random creep, a misguided prank. But the unease in my chest wouldn't go away, and when I glanced out the window at the dark street, I half expected to see headlights creeping back toward the house. I wasn't safe. Not yet. The late afternoon sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows of the laundromat, casting long, tired shadows across the rows of humming machines. I was halfway through folding my clothes when I noticed him, a man, maybe in his late 40s, standing near the entrance. He seemed too still for a place like this, where people usually shuffled in and out quickly. His eyes were fixed on the door, but not in a casual way. It was like he was waiting for someone, or something. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the clean shirt I just pulled from the dryer. But then I heard it, a faint scraping noise behind me, like nails on metal. My eyes darted to the end of the room toward the service door that led to the alley. It was slightly ajar, the latch not fully engaged. I hadn't noticed it when I came in. The man near the entrance shifted, his gaze flicking to that door too. He squared his shoulders as if deciding whether to move toward it or not. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just a regular who came in early to avoid the crowds, or maybe he worked here and had forgotten to close that door properly. Still, my chest tightened. The laundromat was nearly empty, the usual hum of conversation replaced by the low whir of machines and the occasional thud of a washer finishing its cycle. No one else was near. I moved deliberately toward the exit, clutching my laundry basket a little tighter. My keys felt cold in my palm, the familiar metal somehow reassuring. The man hadn't moved, but I sensed his eyes on me now, tracking my steps. I could feel his gaze crawl across my back like a slow, unwelcome touch. When I reached the door, I glanced back. He was still there, standing as still as a statue, almost blending into the peeling paint of the wall behind him. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but my gut was screaming at me to leave. I pulled open the door and stepped outside. The street was quiet, the sky bruised with the early signs of dusk. I heard footsteps behind me, deliberate and slow. I didn't look back, didn't want to confirm what I already feared. My pace quickened. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze felt oppressive, like they were closing in. I could still hear those footsteps, steady and unhurried, matching mine step for step. When I reached my car parked under a street lamp that flickered weakly, my hands trembled as I fished for my keys. The man appeared at the corner of the sidewalk, his face catching the yellow light. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but something about them set my nerves alight. He didn't make a move toward me, just watched. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine without looking at him again. The breath I had been holding escaped in a shaky exhale. As I pulled away, I caught a glimpse of him standing there, alone on the sidewalk, disappearing into the gathering shadows. The relief was temporary, but it was enough to drive me home. I kept the locks engaged, the windows up, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever just happened was far from over. The streetlights flickered as I drove through the neighborhood, each pulse of dim yellow casting long, jittery shadows across the cracked pavement. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him, that figure, still lurking behind me, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. But the road behind me was empty, save for the drifting leaves and an occasional stray cat slinking into the night. Still, the weight in my chest refused to lift. Every instinct screamed at me that whatever I just escaped wasn't done. That presence, the coldness that had seeped into my bones, hadn't dissipated with the distance. At home, I tore the keys from the ignition and bolted inside, locking every door and window with trembling hands. My apartment felt smaller, more suffocating than ever before. The shadows clung to the corners, creeping along the baseboards and pooling near the ceiling like ink blotches spreading on old paper. I needed to call someone. Anyone. But who? Friends had drifted away over the years, and family was hundreds of miles away. Besides, how do you explain this? A stranger who doesn't speak, who just watches, who waits. And why me? The silence in my apartment was thick, punctuated only by the occasional groan of the old wooden floorboards as the building settled. I sat down on the couch, trying to steady my breathing, to ground myself in something real. But the air felt off, too heavy, too still. Then the phone rang. It was my cell, vibrating insistently on the coffee table. I hesitated, staring at the screen. No caller ID. No number. Just the generic unknown. My heart thumped erratically. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part, some foolish hope, made me reach out. The moment I answered, the line was filled with static. Then, faintly, a whisper. At first, I couldn't make out the words, just a soft hissing, like wind through dry leaves. You can't hide. The voice was barely audible but unmistakably close, as if the speaker was right next to my ear. Goosebumps erupted along my arms. I dropped the phone, but it continued to vibrate, the whisper repeating, growing louder, more urgent. You can't hide. Dread churned in my stomach. I scrambled to turn off the phone, hit airplane mode, anything to cut the connection. The whisper ceased abruptly, leaving an echoing silence that felt heavier than before. I sat frozen, my mind racing. How did he get my number? Was this some cruel joke or something worse? The impossibility of it only deepened my fear. Suddenly, a faint tapping sound came from the window behind me. Slowly, I turned, every nerve screaming. Outside, nothing but darkness. Then, a single knock, sharp, deliberate, a pattern I couldn't ignore. I edged closer, heart pounding, and peered through the blinds. Nothing. Just the empty street, the swaying branches, the distant hum of a car passing by. But then I saw it, a silhouette, faint but unmistakable, standing just beyond the pool of light from the street lamp. His face was obscured, but the outline was the same. The Watcher. I slammed the blind shut, bolted the window, and retreated to the center of the room. My breath hitched. I felt utterly trapped, ensnared in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. And the worst part? I knew this was just the beginning. Because somewhere out there, in the dark, he was waiting. Watching. Patient. I told myself it was just a coincidence when I saw the same gray sedan parked across the street every morning as I waited for the bus. It was always there, idling, windows tinted too dark for me to see inside. The driver was never visible, just the shape of a person slouched behind the wheel. At first, I thought maybe it was someone who worked a nearby shift or a neighbor lounging in their car. But after 3 mornings, the feeling in my gut wasn't just unease, it was outright dread. That Thursday morning, I left the apartment at 6:45, early enough so the streets were still quiet and the air kept the damp chill that clung to the pavement after last night's rain. I zipped up my jacket tighter, trying to ignore the scrape of cracked concrete under my boots. The sedan was there, exactly where I'd seen it before. Its engine ticked softly against the silence, and as I looked, the driver's head turned slowly, like he had been watching me all along. I froze, a cold spike behind my ribs. I told myself not to show fear, but my pulse hammered in my ears. The bus stop was a few blocks away, past a row of shuttered shops and a narrow alley I always tried to avoid after dark. Today, it looked even darker than usual. The flickering street lamps did more to confuse than to illuminate. I kept my eyes on the sedan as I hurried forward, heart thudding louder with every step. When I glanced back, the car was gone. I tried to push the anxiety out of my mind during the ride to work, focusing on the rhythm of the city waking up, the murmur of conversations floating between passengers, the hum of the engine. But it lingered, that prickling sense that someone was watching me, not from far away, but close enough to breathe down my neck. Work was uneventful, just the usual grind of paperwork and phone calls. I barely noticed the time until my phone buzzed with a message from my landlord. Maintenance will be checking your unit today between 3 and 5. I hadn't mentioned any issues, and I didn't remember any calls arranging this. I replied, asking for a reason, but got no answer. At 4:45, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the thin curtains of my apartment. I sat on the worn couch, eyes flicking to the front door every few seconds. A soft knock echoed through the hallway, precise and controlled. I waited a beat, then called out, "Who is it?" "Maintenance." "Got the notice from the landlord," a man's voice said, low and calm. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my phone. I didn't want to open the door, but if it was official, I had no choice. I cracked it open a few inches, enough to see the man's face dimly lit by the hallway light. He wore a faded blue shirt and a cap pulled low, but there was something off in his eyes, too steady, too focused. "Can I see some ID?" I asked, voice barely steady. He smiled thinly, reaching inside his shirt pocket and pulling out a badge. It was small, plastic, with the landlord's name and a photo I didn't recognize. It looked real enough at a glance. "Everything checks out," he said. "Just a quick inspection." My throat felt dry. I wasn't informed about anything specific. Routine. Just doing our rounds. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him. I wanted to slam the door, to tell him to leave, but I was frozen. He moved methodically, checking the windows, the locks, even peering into the bedroom and kitchen. Nothing was out of place, no signs of damage or leaks. Still, the way he moved didn't feel right, too deliberate, like he was mapping the space rather than fixing anything. When he finished, he lingered near the door. "If you notice anything strange, you call me. Here's my number." He handed me a business card. I took it with shaking hands, eyes fixed on his face, searching for any hint of menace. He gave a curt nod and left, closing the door softly behind him. I locked it immediately, sliding the deadbolt home. Then I sat down, trying to calm the rapid pace of my thoughts. The card looked legitimate, but the whole thing didn't add up. Why show up unannounced and linger like that? That night, I triple-checked the locks and dragged a chair under the doorknob, just in case. The city noises outside faded until there was only the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. The room felt smaller, the shadows deeper. Around midnight, I heard a soft tapping at the window. My heart leapt. I peered through the blinds, but the street below was empty. The tap came again, steady and slow, like a deliberate rhythm. I pulled the curtain aside a fraction and squinted into the darkness. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Still, the tapping continued for a few seconds before stopping abruptly. I tried to convince myself it was a stray branch or rain against the glass, but I knew better. It was too precise to be random. Sleep was impossible. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my phone, eyes darting to every shadow and corner. The gray sedan had returned, or someone else had taken its place, I didn't know. But I felt watched, hunted in a way that no ordinary fear could explain. The next morning, I found the business card resting on the doormat. I hadn't left the apartment since the inspection. The edges were ragged, as if it had been shoved under the door roughly. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. On the back, in shaky handwriting, someone had written, "We know." I dropped the card. For the first time, I didn't know who I could trust. The landlord, the mysterious maintenance man, the dark sedan that seemed to appear and disappear like a shadow. I realized then that the danger wasn't going away. It was closing in, piece by piece, day after day. I had to figure out what they wanted before it was too late. I was supposed to meet Jamie at the small cafe near the train station. After the weird texts from yesterday, I figured a public place would be safest, and besides, the afternoon sun was soft and warm enough to lull any sense of urgency into complacency. I pulled my jacket tighter around my waist and checked my phone again. No new messages. The cafe wasn't crowded, just the usual mix of students tapping at laptops and a few older people nursing coffees. I spotted Jamie immediately, sitting near the window with his head down, scrolling through his phone. His face looked tense, more than usual. I slid into the seat opposite him, and he glanced up quickly, forcing a smile. "Hey," he said, voice quieter than I expected. "Hey," I replied. "Any news?" He shook his head. "Nothing. But I don't like how this is going." The text stopped for a while, then started again last night. "I think someone's watching me." I swallowed. "Watching you? Like, in person?" "Maybe. Or someone who knows my schedule well enough to time it." He paused, biting his lip. "I found a stranger outside my apartment yesterday morning, just standing there. Didn't move when I looked at him, just stared. I frowned. Did you call the cops? Not yet. I wanted to see if it was a coincidence. But today, I swear, someone followed me on the bus. When I got off, they got off too. I ducked into a store, and they walked by slowly, looking straight at me. For the first time, a chill ran down my back that had little to do with the brisk air outside. This wasn't random anymore. Someone was deliberately tracking Jamie. Have you told your landlord? Neighbors? No. I don't want to make a fuss until I'm sure. His fingers trembled slightly as he gripped his coffee cup. But I'm scared. We sat in silence for a moment, the muffled noise of the cafe filling the air like a thin curtain between us and the unknown. I wanted to believe this was paranoia, but the look in Jamie's eyes said otherwise. Maybe we should stick together for a while, I suggested. Don't go anywhere alone. Jamie nodded, but I could tell he hated the idea of being pinned down or watched even more. I glanced at my watch and realized I had less than an hour before my shift at the bookstore started. I couldn't just sit here all day. Do you want me to walk you back? At least until you get inside? No. Thanks. I think I'll take a cab, he said, standing abruptly. I watched him leave, his figure swallowed by the bright afternoon light. The streets felt suddenly too wide, too open. I waited a few minutes, then pulled out my phone to text him, only to see a new message from an unknown number. I'm closer than you think. My heart hammered. I stared around the cafe, trying to spot anyone who might have sent it. The barista was busy wiping down tables. A couple at the corner laughed quietly. No one looked out of place or paying any attention to me. I shoved my phone into my pocket and forced myself to leave. Outside, the sun was fading, and a thin wind rattled the trash in the gutter. I thought about taking a different route to work, but the main street was the quickest, and the thought of wandering empty side alleys only made me more nervous. I moved briskly, scanning faces as I passed, my breath shallow. The rhythm of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet street. Every shadow felt like it might shift, every passerby a potential threat. Halfway to the bookstore, I noticed a man across the street who seemed to be walking in the same direction as me. He was average height, wearing a dark jacket zipped up to his chin, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. Nothing about him screamed danger, but the way he kept glancing over his shoulder made me uneasy. I crossed to the other side, figuring I'd lose him by cutting through a small park. But when I turned into the green space, the trees were sparse, the late afternoon sun casting long, ominous shadows. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, steady, deliberate. I didn't dare look back. I picked up my pace until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to buckle. The footsteps quickened too, matching mine. Panic rushed in, sharp and cold. I broke into a run toward the park exit, heart slamming against my ribs. As I burst onto the next street, I risked a glance back. The man was there, but now he was moving at a jogging pace, still following. I ducked into a convenience store, gasping for breath. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I scanned the aisles. A middle-aged clerk stood behind the counter, eyes flicking up from a magazine. I didn't know what to say, how to explain, but I gestured toward the door and whispered, "Someone's following me. Can I wait here until they leave?" The clerk nodded slowly, his calmness both reassuring and strange. "Stay as long as you need." I crouched by the wall, clutching my bag, every nerve screaming. Minutes passed like hours. The bell above the door jingled occasionally as other customers came and went, but they didn't stay long. After what felt like forever, I peeked out. The street was empty. I thanked the clerk and stepped outside cautiously. The man was gone. Shaking, I made my way to the bookstore, locking the door behind me and double-checking the bolts. The familiar scent of old paper and dusty shelves should have been comforting, but instead it felt like a fragile barrier against chaos. I sat down behind the counter, phone in hand, debating whether to call the police. But what would I say? Someone had followed me, a vague threat in a text, but no proof, no evidence. I sent Jamie a quick message, "We need to talk. This is serious." My fingers trembled as I hit send. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, their pale glow casting long shadows that felt like watching eyes. And I realized this was only the beginning. I left the diner later than usual, the clock pushing past midnight, and the parking lot lights flickered weakly through the drizzle. The rain was light but steady, the kind that doesn't soak you immediately but leaves you damp and chilled from the inside. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and walked to my car, trying to shake off the exhaustion from a 14-hour shift. The streets were nearly empty. The only sounds were the soft tapping of rain on the pavement and the occasional distant hum of a late-night delivery truck. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, the heater coughing to life. As I started the engine, I noticed a figure across the street, standing under the faint glow of a street lamp. At first, I thought it was just someone waiting for a ride or a cab, but something felt off. The person wasn't moving much, just standing still, hands tucked in the pockets of a dark hoodie, head tilted slightly downward. I blinked, and the figure seemed to shift, as if noticing me looking. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably no one, just someone waiting out the rain. But then, as I pulled out of the lot, I saw the figure step off the curb and begin walking in my direction. The street was nearly deserted, so it felt odd, standing in the middle of the sidewalk like that. I hesitated at the stop sign, engine idling, and watched the person. They kept walking, slow and steady, but didn't cross the street to head away from me. They stayed on my side, maintaining that same pace. My heart ticked up a notch. I debated whether to drive off quickly, but the rain had made the streets slick, and the car felt sluggish. I decided to wait, pretending to look at my dashboard, hoping the figure would pass by or turn onto a side street. But they didn't. I watched them raise their head, and through the dim streetlight, I saw eyes fixed on me. Not just a glance, but an intense, unwavering stare. I swallowed hard and pulled away slowly, turning onto the next street, hoping to lose whoever was there. The figure didn't quicken pace but followed, keeping a steady distance, never close enough to be overtly threatening, but close enough to be unnerving. I glanced in the rearview mirror, heart thumping, and saw them appear at the next intersection, waiting for me to approach, then moving again once I passed. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was coincidence, someone heading home and just pacing the neighborhood. Maybe not. But no matter how many turns I took left, right, looping around blocks, they kept appearing just behind me, always that slow, deliberate pace. I switched off the main roads and onto a dimly lit residential street, hoping the neighborhood's scattered houses would mean the person would back off. The streetlights here were older, their yellow glow barely pushing through the fog rolling in from the river nearby. I kept the car windows up and doors locked, fingers gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I reached over, heart in my throat, and grabbed the screen illuminated with a text, "Nice jacket." I froze. I hadn't given anyone my number, and I certainly hadn't told anyone what I was wearing tonight. I stared out the windshield toward the shadowy figure now standing at the mouth of the street, just beyond the street lamp's reach. No phone, no visible device, just watching. The text came from a number I didn't recognize, no area code familiar to me. I tried calling it back, but the line was dead. I locked the phone screen and shoved it into my jacket pocket, fingers trembling. I considered driving to the police station or a 24-hour gas station, anywhere with people, but the nearest station was still 5 miles away down a road I didn't know well. I didn't want to risk taking a long route with someone following me. I kept driving slowly, eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and side windows. The figure disappeared from view momentarily as I turned another corner, and I exhaled sharply. Relief, but temporary. I knew they were still out there, waiting. I spotted a convenience store up ahead, the kind with bright fluorescent lights, multiple cameras outside, and a few cars in the lot. I pulled in, parked near the entrance under a CCTV camera, and left the engine running. Inside, the store clerk glanced at me with a polite nod, no questions asked. I grabbed a bottle of water and a candy bar, trying to calm my breathing. The fluorescent buzz overhead was harsh, unnatural, but it felt better than the dark streets. I peered out the window. The street outside was empty. No sign of the figure. Maybe they'd given up, or maybe they were just waiting for me to leave. I paid an exact change, my hands still shaking, and walked back out to the car. I started the car and backed out slowly. As I turned onto the street, headlights appeared in the distance, another car coming my way. I felt a small spark of hope. I could pull over and flag someone down if I needed to. But as the car came closer, I noticed it wasn't slowing down. It was speeding, headlights blinding and fixed directly on me. I stepped on the brake, heart pounding, and the other car swerved suddenly onto a side lane before I could even react. The driver never slowed, disappearing down an alley. I sat frozen for a moment, the rain now stronger, pattering hard against the windshield. My breath fogged the glass. I drove home the fastest I dared, the streetlights blurring past, and locked every door and window as soon as I stepped inside. The house felt colder than usual, and I kept the lights on, pacing the living room. I checked my phone again, no new messages, no calls. But the sense of being watched clung to the walls, and every creak and groan in the old house sounded like a warning. I sat by the window, pulling the curtain just enough to see the empty street. No sign of the figure, no car. But I knew they were out there, somewhere, waiting for the next move. The quiet night felt fragile, like the calm before something worse. I tried to convince myself it would end here, that it was just some twisted prank or coincidence. But the message, the stalking, the way they followed me, it wasn't random. The nightmare wasn't over, and I didn't know if I was ready for what came next. Story 5, The Veil Behind Room 613. I worked the late shift at the grocery store on the edge of town, the one tucked beneath the highway overpass where the streetlights flickered and the neighborhood felt quieter than it should after dark. Most nights were uneventful, just me stacking shelves and ringing up the occasional customer, but that Tuesday started with a strange chill that didn't seem to belong to the early spring air. When I left the store at 11:45, the wind was sharper than usual, tugging at the collar of my coat as I pulled my keys from my pocket. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a battered sedan parked 3 rows away from mine. I didn't think much of it until I saw the driver's side window roll down slowly, the motion so deliberate it caught my attention like a sudden silence in a noisy room. No one was inside. The car sat there, idling, the engine humming low enough to feel in my bones. I stood frozen for a moment, half expecting someone to pop out, but the lot was empty besides me and that silent car. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably a malfunctioning power window or someone who left it running by mistake. I hurried toward my car, not bothering to look back. The drive home was the same empty stretch of 2-lane roads bordered by thick woods that swallowed any light from passing cars. I kept the windows rolled up and the radio faintly playing, mostly to drown out the thud of my own heartbeat, which had sped up without reason. About 10 minutes in, I noticed headlights behind me in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another car on the highway, but as I took the winding curves, the headlights stayed locked on my tail. I tried not to panic, telling myself it's normal for people to drive the same route, especially at this hour. Still, the light stayed steady, never swerving or passing. A knot tightened in my stomach when I took a left turn onto a side road, the one with the dead end and the old, abandoned houses. The headlights turned with me, following precisely. My hands gripped the wheel harder, knuckles white. I flicked my turn signal to indicate a right, hoping to lose whoever it was, but the headlights did the same, like a shadow glued to my car. Then the radio cut out suddenly, static filling the space. I twisted the dial, but nothing came through. My breath hitched. With the road narrowing and trees crowding closer, I slowed down, considering pulling over to check my phone, but the battery was low and the signal patchy in this section of town. Out of nowhere, a figure appeared at the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, tires skidding on the gravel shoulder. The person was a man, thin, in a dark hoodie, standing motionless, his face turned toward me but shrouded in shadow. My heart pounded so loud I thought the whole car would shake. I glanced in the rear view again. The headlights had pulled alongside me now, matching my speed almost exactly. The man lifted a hand, waving, but there was no warmth in the gesture, just an unsettling stillness. I didn't know what to do. My instinct screamed at me to drive off, but my foot felt like it was stuck to the floor. The engine idled beneath me, and the night air pressed in on all sides. Suddenly, the car behind flashed its high beams once, twice, then swerved ahead and stopped abruptly in the middle of the road. The man on the side vanished into the darkness as if he'd never been there. I jerked the wheel to the right, tires crunching over gravel as I sped past the other car. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from a number I didn't recognize. I pulled over a little further down, heart racing so violently I could hardly breathe. The screen glowed with a single line of text, "Nice car." I sat there for several minutes, scanning the tree line for movement, my hand shaking too much to text back or call anyone. Eventually, I forced myself to drive the remaining few miles home, glancing nervously in the mirror, but the headlights never returned. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house felt suffocatingly quiet. I locked the door behind me and checked every window, every lock, twice. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and sigh in the house made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the hoodie, the car that followed, and that message. Who was watching me? Why? The next morning, the cracked windshield of my car was smeared with something dark, dirt, or maybe something else. I didn't look too close. My phone buzzed again, a second message from the same unknown number. "We're closer than you think." I swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling in. Somehow, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Heart pounding, I locked the car and hurried inside, the shadows in the corners of the room suddenly seeming to twitch with unseen life. Every creak and whisper of the old house felt amplified, a sinister echo chasing me from room to room. I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to know who was watching me, and why. Pulling my coat tighter, I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the hooded figure waiting silently on the porch. The message was clear, this was far from over. I forced myself to breathe, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down like a storm about to break. When I left the diner that night, the streetlights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a jaundiced glow on the cracked sidewalk. It was nearly midnight, but the town still clung to a pulse of life, mostly the occasional late shift worker or someone leaving a bar. I pulled my jacket tighter against the chill, the wind carrying a faint smell of rain and something else, metallic and sharp, that I couldn't place. My phone's battery was low, hovering just above 10%, which made me uneasy, but I told myself it was fine. I'd made the mistake of forgetting my charger downstairs, and anyway, it was only a 15-minute walk back to my apartment. The diner's neon sign flickered behind me, sputtering in and out like a stuttered heartbeat. I glanced over my shoulder and caught a shadow standing by the corner, half hidden in the dark. A man, tall, coat collar pulled up, hands jammed in pockets. His face was obscured by the hood, but his stance felt deliberate, like he was waiting. I told myself I was imagining it. The heavy coat didn't belong to anyone here this time of year. Still, my steps got quicker, and I tried to keep the sound of my boots steady and confident on the pavement. The street emptied as I turned onto Maple Avenue. The houses here were old, many boarded up or showing peeling paint. Most windows were dark, but a few had dim lights, yellow curtains fluttering in half-open windows. I felt that unsettling sensation again, someone watching. It's hard to explain, but it wasn't just paranoia. It was a cold pressure against the back of my skull that made me want to turn around and run. I texted my roommate, Sarah, a quick almost home. I didn't expect a reply, but a little connection was reassuring. The phone buzzed once. A message. Not from Sarah. It was a number I didn't recognize, just a single sentence, "You shouldn't be walking alone tonight." My heart hit a lurch. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the message. No contact name. No signature. Just a warning. I considered calling the police, but my battery was slipping fast, and I didn't want to risk making noise if someone was actually nearby. I slipped the phone into my pocket and scanned the street. No one in sight. The wind picked up, carrying the crunch of dry leaves across the road. I kept walking, trying to focus on the rhythm of my breath. My hands tingled from the cold, and I tucked them deeper into my coat pockets. About halfway down the block, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a figure stepping out from a shadowed driveway. The streetlight flickered just then, and for a second, I thought the figure was reaching for something. My pulse quickened. I didn't stop, kept walking, but my feet slowed. The figure matched my pace, maybe 15 feet behind. "Hey," a voice called out softly. It was male, almost casual, but with an edge I couldn't place. I didn't answer. Just wanted to say, "You dropped this." Something small and round hit the ground near my feet. I glanced down. It was a keychain, plain metal, no distinguishing marks. I looked back up, but the man was already fading back into the darkness between two houses. I stooped to pick up the keychain, but my fingers trembled too much to get a firm grip. When I finally caught it, the cold metal was heavier than I expected. It didn't belong to me. I looked around. No one. No sign of him. I debated whether to keep walking or turn back, but the thought of retracing my steps made my skin crawl. I pulled out my phone and tried calling Sarah again. No answer. I left a voicemail, my voice shaky but trying to sound calm. The last 5 minutes felt endless. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to reappear or worse, to be waiting by my door when I got home. When I finally saw the dull glow of the porch light, relief swept through me so strongly I almost stumbled. The keychain was still in my hand. I stuffed it into my coat pocket. I unlocked the door. Something about the metal against my palm made me pause, and stepped inside, locking it quickly behind me. Inside was silent except for the faint hum of the heater. Sarah's bedroom light was off. I called her name softly. No answer. I checked the living room, kitchen empty. My stomach dropped. She should have been home hours ago. That keychain didn't belong to me, and neither did that warning text or the man who followed me. Something was wrong, and I didn't know what or why. But the feeling in my gut wouldn't let me pretend it was over. I sat down on the couch, the shadows in the room pressing close. The keychain was heavy in my pocket, cold as ice. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Instead, I called Sarah one more time. The call went straight to voicemail. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, and a branch scraped against the glass like fingernails. I swallowed hard, the room seeming suddenly too big and too empty. Whatever was out there wasn't finished with me yet. I stood, heart pounding, and edged toward the window. The street below was deserted, but a faint flicker caught my eye as shadow moving just beyond the fog. The keychain burned in my palm, as if warning me, some doors, once opened, never truly close. I never used to worry much about the walk home from work, even after dark. The streets in my neighborhood had always felt safe enough, quiet cul-de-sacs, neighbors who waved as they trimmed their hedges, the occasional jogger passing by. But that Tuesday, something about the air felt off. Not the heavy, unmistakable scent of rain that usually came with a storm, but a subtle, sour odor that I couldn't place. It was like the street itself was holding its breath. I left the office at exactly 7:03 p.m., just like every day, stepping out into the early evening chill. The sky was a dull gray, the fading light casting long shadows between the street lamps that hadn't quite flickered on yet. The pavement was still damp from a light drizzle earlier, and my boots made soft, rhythmic taps as I walked. I was tired but looking forward to dinner and a quiet night in. The week had been draining, and the thought of my warm apartment kept me moving. As I crossed the intersection at 5th and Elm, I noticed a man sitting on the bench by the bus stop. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled tight over his head, shoulders hunched, hands tucked deep into his pockets. At first, I didn't think much of it. People waited there all the time. What unsettled me was the way he was staring at the ground, almost as if he was trying not to be seen. His legs were stretched out awkwardly, one boot tapping nervously against the concrete. I looked away quickly and kept walking. The street was unusually quiet, devoid of the usual hum of passing cars or distant laughter from nearby bars. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out. No new messages. Just a reminder I'd set earlier about a meeting tomorrow. I pocketed it and glanced back toward the man. He was gone. A flicker of unease washed over me. Where had he gone so fast? The bus stop had no side streets behind it, just a chain link fence bordering a small, empty lot. I decided not to think about it and picked up my pace. The click of my boots seemed unnaturally loud on the wet pavement. As I turned onto my street, the houses felt darker than usual, their windows blackened against the gathering dusk. A few porch lights blinked on, casting weak halos over cracked steps and unkempt flower beds. I passed the house on the corner, the one with the rusted mailbox and peeling paint, when I caught the faint sound of something scraping against wood. I stopped and listened. It was gone. Maybe a branch brushing against the siding, or a loose shutter flapping. I told myself it was nothing. The street narrowed here, the trees crowding in close overhead. Their skeletal branches rattled against each other in the rising wind. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling a chill that had little to do with temperature. Ahead, the glow from my apartment's window was a pale promise. Just a few more minutes. That's when I noticed the footsteps behind me. They started small at first, muffled by the wet leaves scattered across the sidewalk. I heard a soft thud, then another, steady and deliberate. I stopped and turned quickly, heart pounding. No one was there. Just the shadows stretching long and dark between the street lamps. I stepped forward again, faster this time, and the footsteps matched my pace. I checked my phone, this time to turn on the flashlight, but my hands trembled so badly I almost dropped it. The beam cut through the gathering gloom, illuminating cracks in the sidewalk, the shiny wetness of fallen leaves, the occasional flicker of a moth around a street lamp. The steps behind me grew louder, less tentative. Not quite running, but definitely faster than a casual walk. My throat tightened. I considered calling someone, but the words got stuck before I could even unlock my phone. I didn't want to make a scene, and if it was just some drunk kid messing around, I figured I might just make it home quickly and be safe inside. Then I heard a voice. "Hey," it said, low and gravelly, barely above a murmur. "Wait up." I didn't recognize the voice, but it was close, too close. I risked a glance back and caught sight of a man's silhouette illuminated by the weak glow from a street lamp. His head was low, collar turned up against the wind, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. I picked up speed. The sidewalk cracked under my boots. My breath came in short gasps. "I'm in a hurry," I called without turning around, hoping to sound confident. "Just a minute," he said. The voice was calm but persistent. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Something about the tone made my skin crawl. I knew better than to engage. My eyes searched for any sign of other people, any light from a nearby house. The street was deserted. I reached into my pocket and gripped the small can of pepper spray I always carried during late shifts, a habit I'd never needed before. My fingers fumbled with the cap as the footsteps quickened behind me. The man was gaining ground. "Stop," he said. "Let's talk." Panic blossomed in my chest. I spun around, pressed the pepper spray to his face, and squeezed hard. He yelped, stumbling back, hands flying to his eyes. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I turned and bolted toward my building, the sharp sting of his words echoing behind me. "Wait, please." I reached the door, fumbled for my keys, and finally slipped inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. My heart pounded deafeningly in my ears. I leaned against the door for a long moment, breathing hard, listening. Outside, the footsteps faded into silence. I checked the peephole, no sign of him. I locked every door and window in the apartment twice over, then called my closest friend, who promised to come by in the morning. I didn't sleep well that night, every creak and groan of the building setting my nerves on edge. The next day, I found out via the neighborhood app that a man matching his description had been seen loitering around several streets, apparently asking strangers for directions or favors. No one had reported anything more threatening until I did. That incident changed something in me. The walk I once took without thought now felt like a gauntlet. My safe streets weren't so safe anymore. I started varying my route, looking over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. The man hadn't come back, and maybe he never would. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only the beginning. The bus had been late, again. I remember that because I checked my watch 3 times in the 20 minutes I waited at the stop near the old mill road. It was already dark by the time I got on, the street lights flickering unevenly, casting overlapping pools of orange that barely cut through the cold mist settling over the neighborhood. Usually, the ride home from the city took about 20 minutes, but tonight, the bus crawled. Every few blocks it paused, and I noticed a man sitting a couple of rows behind me, his face half hidden under the bill of a baseball cap, even though it was dark enough not to need one. I tried not to look at him, but I caught glimpses of those eyes every time the bus jolted or took a sharp turn. There was something off about the way he stared, too steady, too patient. I shifted my bag closer to my side, feeling the weight of the laptop inside. I always carried it everywhere now, between work and freelance gigs, but tonight I wished I hadn't. It already felt like a target. The bus finally stopped in my neighborhood, a quiet stretch of single-family homes with cracked sidewalks and dead trees lining the streets. I got off, the cold biting through my jacket, and started walking toward my front door, glancing over my shoulder a few times. The man from the bus wasn't there, or anywhere in sight. I exhaled slowly, almost laughing at myself for feeling unnerved. My house was dark except for the weak glow of the street lamp outside, and I fumbled for my keys in the pocket of my coat. As I jiggled the lock, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel behind me. I froze, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had come. I dared to look back. No one. Just the empty street, shadows pooling like ink around the parked cars. Inside, I locked the door and double-checked the deadbolt. The silence was suffocating. Usually, my dog, Max, would greet me at the door, but he was at my parents' house for the week. The quiet made the house feel too big, too hollow. I flipped on the living room light, the harsh fluorescent bulb buzzing overhead. I wanted to tell myself I was just tired, that the unease was a trick of the mind after a long day. I scrolled through my phone, trying to distract myself, but the battery was almost dead. I plugged it into the charger in the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the clink of the ice cubes unnervingly loud. As I stood there, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, the reflection in the kitchen window. A silhouette, someone standing just beyond the edge of the porch light's reach. My breath hitched, and my hand trembled as I grabbed a knife from the counter. I edged toward the door, peering out through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty except for the damp leaves swirling in the wind. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor walking their dog or a kid out late, but the silence told me otherwise. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Carter, the elderly woman who lived a few houses down. Her phone rang once, twice, then straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice quieter than I expected. "Hi, it's me. Just wanted to check in. If you're out, no worries." The line went dead, and I was alone again with the darkness. I moved to the window in the living room, but the curtains were thin, and I saw nothing. The street was deserted. I locked the windows, dragging the curtains closed, then turned off every light except a small lamp in the corner. The shadows felt less like shadows then, more like waiting things. I tried to call my sister, but the call didn't connect. The phone buzzed with the message that the number was unreachable. I bit my lip, fighting the rising panic in my chest. What if something was wrong? What if the man from the bus had followed me here? Suddenly, there was a soft tapping at the front window. My heart slammed against my ribs as I moved toward it, every step heavier than the last. The window was fogged from the inside, but I wiped a circle with my sleeve. There was a face staring back at me, a man's. He wasn't the one from the bus, but his eyes were cold and unblinking. No words, no movement except the slow, deliberate tapping of his fingers on the glass. I jumped back, stumbling over the rug, and the face vanished. I locked the window and slid the bolt home. Then came a heavier sound, a thud against the side of the house, like a fist hitting wood. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself small, trying not to scream. The phone finally lit up. My sister's name flashed on the screen. With trembling hands, I answered. Her voice was calm but tense. "Are you okay? I heard yelling from your place a few minutes ago." I'm not sure." "Someone's here," I whispered. "They're tapping on my window. I don't know what they want." "Stay where you are," she said firmly. "I'm calling Dad. He's on his way. Lock everything." I hung up and moved to the back door, checking it twice. Footsteps circled the house. Not far away, not retreating. I heard scraping at the back fence, then silence. A shadow slipped past the window, too fast to see clearly. I grabbed my phone, now clutched like a lifeline, and dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, methodical, but I could hear the strain in my own breathing as I described the situation. "Someone's outside. I don't know if they're trying to break in." "Stay on the line," she said. "Help is on the way." I crouched behind the sofa, the knife still in my hand. The tapping started again, slower this time, almost rhythmic. I counted the seconds between each tap. 2, 3, 4. Then a pause. Then a single, sharp knock on the front door. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed like hours. I could hear distant sirens, growing louder. The tapping stopped. When the police arrived, they found no one outside. No sign of forced entry. just the faint footprints in the damp grass and the broken branches by the fence. I told them everything: the man on the bus, the face in the window, the tapping and the knocking. They said it could have been a prankster or a stalker, but nothing concrete. They promised to keep patrols in the area over the next few nights. As I locked the door behind them, the street was quiet again. But the weight of eyes watching didn't lift. I knew this was only the beginning. The wind was sharper than I expected that late in September, and the streetlights along Maple Avenue flickered as if struggling to stay on. I was walking home from the diner where I'd worked the night shift, my jacket pulled tight around me despite the mild temperature. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the pavement was slick from an earlier shower. It should have been a quiet, uneventful walk, just 7 blocks from work to my apartment, the kind of familiar route I'd taken hundreds of times before. But that night, the shadows felt heavier, and the silence seemed unnatural. I glanced over my shoulder again. Nothing there but the empty street, though the streetlight just behind me suddenly blinked out, plunging that section of sidewalk into darkness. I quickened my pace, heels tapping unevenly on the wet concrete. The diner's neon sign was still glowing faintly in the distance, a sliver of red amidst the dull yellow glow of the street lamps. I was close now, almost home. On the corner ahead, a man sat on a bench under a flickering streetlight. He was hunched over, dressed in a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. I couldn't make out his features, but something about the way he sat, it wasn't just slouched or tired, it was deliberate, like he was waiting for something or someone. Usually, that bench was empty at this hour. My stomach tightened. I considered crossing the street, but the intersection was just a few feet ahead, and I worried that would make me look paranoid, like I was afraid to walk past him. I decided to keep going but slowed a little, partly to keep calm, partly to keep him in view. If he was dangerous, I wanted to be sure I knew what I was dealing with. As I passed, the man didn't look up. I heard the scrape of his shoe against the concrete when he pushed off the bench. I started walking faster. Then I heard the faint shuffle of footsteps behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I tried not to breathe too loudly, but my heartbeat sounded like a drum in my ears. My steps quickened, careful not to break into a run because I didn't want to make a scene or draw too much attention. The street emptied out beyond the corner, and I told myself that if he was following me, he would have made his move already. Maybe it was just my imagination. But the footsteps stayed. Steady, measured. Not too close, but definitely behind me. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The man had the hood still up, and now I could see his face was pale, eyes sharp and scanning. He didn't look like someone who was lost or drunk. There was something cold and unblinking about him. I crossed to the other side of the street, dodging a low-hanging branch from a tree, and quickened my pace. He followed. My mind raced through possibilities. Call out for help? Yell? Run? I was too far from any neighbors, and the street was deserted. My phone was in my pocket, but my fingers felt clumsy trying to pull it out. I didn't want to look vulnerable, but I needed to do something. At the next intersection, I spotted a convenience store open all night, its harsh fluorescent lights spilling onto the sidewalk. I headed straight for it, hoping the man would stop or that someone inside would notice if I rushed in. I pushed through the glass door, the bell jingling above me. Inside, a tired-looking clerk stared at me over the counter, blinking as if waking from a nap. "Can I help you?" he asked. I tried to sound casual, but my voice cracked. "Yeah, just wanted to use the phone," I lied, though my phone was already in my hand. I glanced through the window toward the street. The man was still outside, standing by the curb, watching the store. His posture was rigid, and he seemed to be scanning every exit and entrance. "I think someone's following me," I whispered to the clerk, trying to keep my voice low. He frowned but didn't get up. You want me to call the cops? I nodded, relief flooding me. I pulled out my phone, ready to dial 911 myself, but the screen was black. I'd forgotten to charge it during my shift. The clerk sighed and picked up the store phone. "Stay inside," he said. I moved to stand near the door, peering out at the man. He hadn't moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, he raised his head and looked directly through the glass at me. Our eyes met. There was no smile. No expression at all, really. Just cold calculation. He took a slow step back, melting into the shadows of the alley beside the convenience store. The clerk handed me his phone, the line already open. I gave the address and a description, my hands trembling. "Stay here," he said firmly. I nodded, biting my lip. The store felt too small and too exposed, but it was better than the empty street. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, a police cruiser pulled up. 2 officers stepped inside, their faces serious but professional. They took my statement and promised to look for the man. I watched from the window as they swept the nearby streets and alleys. But the man was gone. I wanted to believe it was over. I wanted to convince myself that the man had just been a loner, a strange figure who meant no harm. But the way he had watched me, like he was waiting for me to be alone and vulnerable, settled into my bones. When the officers left, I thanked the clerk and stepped out into the cool night air. The street seemed quieter now, the wind less urgent. But I didn't breathe deeply. I kept my jacket collar up and my phone pressed against my palm. My steps were quick and deliberate as I walked the last 3 blocks home. Behind me, somewhere in the darkness, I knew he was still out there. Watching. Waiting. And next time, I wasn't sure I'd be so lucky. Story 6, Vanished Hours, The Forgotten Abyss. I finished my shift at the diner a little after midnight, the usual slow trickle of late-night customers tapering off about half an hour earlier than usual. It was the kind of night that felt like it had already given up. The neon open sign buzzed faintly above the door as I locked up behind me, the cold air outside biting through my thin jacket. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a battered silver sedan in the far corner where I had left my car. I made my way over, the gravel crunching underfoot sounding sharper in the quiet night. The streetlights flickered inconsistently, some sputtering out entirely while others cast weak halos over the cracked pavement. I kept my keys in my hand, thumb running over the cool metal, a habit I'd picked up from watching late-night crime shows. I hadn't expected to need it tonight. I slid into the driver's seat and instantly missed the warmth inside the diner. The heater in my car took a long while to warm up, so I sat there a moment, breathing deeply, trying to shake the chill from my limbs. I glanced out the window toward the main road. It was deserted, but I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the sidewalk, a man in a dark hoodie. His posture was relaxed, but he was staring straight at me. I blinked and looked again, but he was still there. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light or that I was just tired, but the fact that he hadn't moved made the air in the car feel thicker. My heart rate ticked upward, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably just someone waiting for a ride, or maybe a jogger who stopped to catch their breath. I unlocked the door swiftly and stepped out, the cold immediately wrapping around me again. The man didn't turn, didn't even glance away, which made my skin crawl. I kept my eyes on him as I walked briskly to the edge of the parking lot. "Hey," I said, voice firmer than I felt. "Do you need something?" No response. Just silence and the faint hum of the streetlights. I tried to see his face in the dim light, but the hood cast a shadow over any features. I took a step closer, fingers tightening around my keys, ready to jab if I needed to. Without warning, he started walking toward the road, then suddenly veered off onto the path leading into the small woods behind the diner. I hesitated, unsure why I cared so much, then decided to get in my car and lock the doors. The man was gone when I looked again, swallowed by the darkened trees lining the edge of the parking lot. The drive home was about 20 minutes and mostly uneventful. The roads were empty, the rhythm of the windshield wipers against a light drizzle the only soundtrack. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, paranoid about headlights I didn't see, shadows that shouldn't have been there. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a car parked across the street. It was an older model sedan, dark blue, with faded paint and windows too tinted to see inside. I wasn't expecting visitors at this hour, and there were no houses directly behind me or across the street, just an abandoned lot, fenced off and overgrown. The car's engine was off, but the headlights flickered once and then stayed dark. I unlocked my door quickly and slipped inside, locking it behind me. As I sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, I noticed something on the passenger seat, a small piece of folded paper. I hadn't put it there. My breath caught. I looked around again, no sign of the dark blue car. I was sure I hadn't seen it leave, but now it was gone. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the note. It was blank. No words, no drawings, no marks, just a plain piece of white paper. I stared at it for a long moment, then tossed it onto the floorboard. My brain raced trying to make sense of it. Was it a prank? Someone trying to scare me? Or something worse? I tried to settle my nerves, telling myself to call a friend, maybe the police, but the thought of explaining a blank note and a strange car felt ridiculous. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, just a weird coincidence, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. I locked all the doors and windows, pulled the blinds tight, and sat in the darkness of my living room, listening for any sound beyond the usual hum of the fridge. Hours passed. No footsteps outside. No headlights. No notes left on my doorstep. I started to relax, too exhausted to stay alert. Then, just as I was about to drift off, my phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. Did you get it? I didn't answer. I didn't know what it was. The room seemed colder, the shadows longer. The dread I thought I had shaken settled back in, heavier this time. I stared at the screen, the soft glow illuminating my anxious face, knowing this was far from over. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart hammering. Could I trust this unknown sender? The room seemed to close in, the walls whispered secrets I didn't want to hear. Then the screen buzzed again. Another message, check under the floorboard. My breath hitched. I hadn't moved since the first text. But curiosity, or maybe fear, drove me to the corner where the loose plank waited, hiding whatever nightmare was about to surface. The night had settled deep when I finally left the diner, the bell over the door tinkling faintly behind me as I stepped into the chill air. It was just past midnight, and the parking lot was nearly empty except for a couple of cars huddled under the weak glow of the street lamps. The diner's fluorescent sign buzzed softly, flickering in the darkness. I tucked my coat tighter around me, the wind carrying a sharp, damp smell that settled in my lungs. I was heading back to my apartment, a modest place a few blocks down on a quiet street lined with aging townhouses. It was the kind of neighborhood that still had porch lights on in the late hours but felt empty enough after dark to keep you on edge. I quickened my pace, the heels of my boots clicking against the cracked pavement, echoing in the stillness. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The street was empty. No late-night joggers or wandering teenagers, just the occasional rustle of leaves caught in a stubborn breeze. But then, halfway between the diner and my building, I caught sight of a figure standing under one of the street lamps, motionless. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. The light didn't quite reach him, casting long shadows that swallowed his features. I felt a flicker of unease but told myself it was probably just someone waiting for a ride or on a smoke break. The neighborhood was quiet, but not dangerous. Not usually. I kept walking, but my footsteps slowed, and I found myself glancing back every few seconds. The figure hadn't moved. If anything, he seemed to be watching me. A knot tightened in my stomach. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing the small pepper spray canister I carried, a habit I'd picked up after a few minor run-ins with drunks on late shifts. My pace quickened again, heart thudding in my chest. The street lamp buzzed overhead, the light flickering erratically as if it were struggling against the darkness itself. The man's shadow stretched long and thin behind him. I focused on the cracked sidewalk, pretending I didn't feel the weight of his gaze. When I was just a few steps away, the man took a slow step forward. That was all it took to break my resolve. I broke into a jog, the sound of my boots pounding the pavement loud in my ears, and my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I didn't dare look back again until I reached the safety of the porch steps leading up to my apartment. I fumbled for my keys, hands trembling as I jiggled the lock. The door swung open, and I slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me and locking it twice. The silence inside was immediate, thick with a heavy, unnatural stillness. I leaned against the door, chest heaving, the heat of adrenaline prickling my skin. I checked the peephole. The street was empty. No sign of a man. No shadow lurking in the pools of light. I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe someone on a late walk, someone waiting for a friend. But the feeling didn't fade. Instead, it settled deeper, a gnawing sense of vulnerability. I moved to the window facing the street and peered out through the blinds. The street lamp was dim, flickering. The man had disappeared. But maybe he hadn't gone far. I closed the blinds and backed away from the window, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I checked the locks on the back door and the windows, double-checked the chain on the front door. The apartment felt too exposed, too fragile. I sat on the edge of the couch, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The phone on the coffee table buzzed with a message. It was from my friend Emma, asking if I wanted to grab coffee tomorrow afternoon. I typed a quick yes, fingers still shaky. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, like nails against glass. My eyes snapped to the living room window. It was the one facing the alley, a narrow, shadowed space between my building and the neighbors. I didn't hear any footsteps outside, just the tapping, slow and deliberate. I stood abruptly, heart hammering, and crossed the room. Peering through the curtain, I saw nothing but darkness. The alley was empty, save for the trash bin shoved to the side and a stray plastic bag caught in the wind, fluttering like a ghost. I laughed nervously and shook my head. It was probably just the wind. Maybe a squirrel or a bird. But the tapping came again, 3 soft, deliberate knocks. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I checked the chain lock again and made sure the windows were fully shut. The apartment suddenly felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in. I tried to ignore the sound, but it was persistent. Tap. 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 Like a slow, steady heartbeat that refused to stop. I grabbed my phone and dialed Emma. "Hey, sorry to call so late, but can you stay on the line with me?" "I'm feeling a little weird," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," she replied immediately, her tone calm and steady. "What's going on?" I explained about the man on the street and the tapping at the window. Emma told me to call the police if I felt threatened, but I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, if maybe I was just tired and jumpy from the late shift. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, and I told Emma I was going to try to sleep. She promised to check in the morning. I shut off the lights and climbed into bed, but sleep didn't come. The room felt cold, too quiet. Every creak in the building, every distant car horn, set my nerves on edge. Then, just as I was finally drifting off, I heard a faint scratching at the front door. Not knocking. Scratching. Like nails or maybe something sharp being dragged slowly across the wood. I froze, breath caught in my throat, listening as the sound stopped abruptly. I didn't move until the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. When I finally summoned the courage to look, there were small, shallow scratches on the door frame, just beneath the peephole. Nothing else. No footprints in the thin layer of dust on the floor. No sign of forced entry. I don't know who it was or why they were there, but the message was clear. Someone had been outside, watching, waiting. And they weren't done yet. I sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding, wondering how long it would be before they came back. I told myself it was just the late shift catching up with me. The hospital's corridors, always sterile and humming with fluorescent light, started to blur into one long, endless gray tunnel by 3 a.m. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the lingering dry cough I'd been ignoring for days, but the shadows in the break room looked longer than usual and every passing footstep felt a little too slow, too deliberate. I stood by the vending machines, flipping a $20 bill between my fingers, trying to shake off the tiredness, when a sound made me freeze. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there, a faint tapping, like nails lightly knocking against glass, coming from the window next to the snack aisle. The window faced the parking lot, which was nearly empty at this hour, littered with cars half covered in frost. I glanced up, heart rate spiking. Nothing was there. Maybe a branch scraping in the wind, or a plastic bag caught on the fence outside. I told myself not to be paranoid and grabbed a bottle of water. The tapping came again. This time, I was sure of it. It was steady, 3 soft knocks, pause, 2 more. I dropped the bottle, and it bounced off the metal vending machine with a hollow clank. The sound stopped. I looked around. No one else was in the break room. The hallway outside was deserted. I pulled my phone from my pocket to call security, but the screen stayed black. No signal. I tried again. Still nothing. The hospital's basement always had the worst reception, a fact I'd grumbled about plenty of times, but this felt off. I debated whether to step outside and check the parking lot, but the cold air outside wasn't appealing, and the place was practically a ghost town. I told myself it had to be the wind again, or maybe a worker still finishing up a contracted repair job somewhere nearby. I turned to leave, but then I noticed something on the other side of the window. A shape had shifted. Not a person, but something tall, too tall to be a trash can or a parked bike. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure crouching down, like someone trying to hide in the shadows. My breath hitched. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and I could hear the distant beeping of monitors and the soft thuds of distant footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I stepped back from the glass slowly, heart pounding. A knot tightened in my stomach, one that had nothing to do with the late-night caffeine crash I'd been fighting. I pulled out my ID badge and pressed the red emergency button on the wall next to the door. It emitted a high-pitched beep that felt far too loud in the dead silence. No one answered. The tapping started again, this time louder, almost frantic. I felt like an animal caught in a trap, eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape. The emergency exit door was next to me, but it was locked. I knew that for sure. Every door in the hospital's service areas had to be secured after dark, no exceptions. I gripped the handle and gave it a desperate wiggle. Nothing. The lock held firm. The tapping stopped suddenly. I held my breath and listened. Then, from the far end of the parking lot, I heard footsteps, rapid, uneven, the kind someone makes when they're running but trying not to be heard. They weren't heading toward the hospital entrance, They were moving parallel to the building, stopping every few yards, like they were pacing, hesitant, or searching. I stepped away from the window and pulled the door closed behind me, locking it automatically. My hands trembled as I dialed 911 on my phone again. This time, the screen lit up, signal bars flickering to life. I told the dispatcher the hospital's address and my situation, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stay inside," the operator said. "Help is on the way." I nodded to myself, though I was alone. I moved to the break room's back wall and crouched behind the vending machines, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Outside, the footsteps stopped. The night was eerily quiet again. I could barely hear my own ragged breathing. Minutes passed like hours. I wanted to believe it was just some drifter passing through, someone bored or lost, but the deliberate tapping, the pacing footsteps, the shape by the window, it was getting harder to fool myself. Suddenly, the emergency exit door rattled violently. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the room. I pressed my back against the wall, heart slamming against my ribs. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. The rattling stopped as abruptly as it began. I stayed still, listening. Then, very faintly, I heard a voice, low and rough, right outside the door. "Get out. Now." I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the words. Was it a threat? A warning? I didn't dare answer. Instead, I edged toward the phone again, calling the dispatcher back. "Please hurry," I whispered. "Someone's trying to break in." The footsteps started again, slower this time, dragging along the pavement, moving away from the door and toward the main entrance. I heard the faint click of a car door opening, then slamming shut. I waited, barely daring to breathe. The hospital was still. The only sound was the distant call of an ambulance siren, drawing closer. When security finally arrived, I was shaking so hard I could barely speak. They swept the parking lot, found no one. But the feeling in my gut didn't ease. Whoever had been out there wasn't just a lost stranger. They knew I worked here. They'd been watching. As the dawn light crept through the windows, I realized this night had changed everything. The hospital felt less like a place of safety and more like a cage. And I wasn't sure how long I could hold on. I was driving home that night, the windshield smeared with a thin film of dirt and rain. The streetlights flickered overhead as I navigated the uneven road out of the industrial park. The radio was dead, no signal, just static. I had left the office later than usual, and the empty stretch of highway ahead felt too quiet. The dashboard clock glowed 11:37, but the night seemed to stretch on forever, folding in on itself like a trap. The car's headlights caught a figure on the shoulder, a man standing still in the dark, wearing a hoodie that swallowed his face. I slowed, not sure what I was expecting, a hitchhiker, maybe, or someone stranded. But something didn't feel right. His hands were in his pockets, and his posture was rigid, almost unnatural. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick, humid, and heavy with that smell of wet asphalt and something metallic like blood or rust. I passed him without thinking, but the unease didn't go away. A mile down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The same figure was standing there again, only this time he was closer to the road, a few feet off the shoulder. The way he breathed in the cold night air was visible, a faint mist curling out from beneath his hood. I told myself to stay calm, to think logically. Maybe he was just walking home? But no residential areas were near this stretch. I hadn't seen another car for miles. I felt my pulse quicken, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. I tried to speed up, but the car shuddered as if it was protesting. The engine coughed, then sputtered. The headlights dimmed. I cursed under my breath, jabbing the gas pedal again. The lights flickered off entirely. Darkness swallowed me, save for the faint glint of a man now directly behind my car. His silhouette was outlined by the distant glow of a gas station across the road, empty, closed. I fumbled with the ignition, turning the key repeatedly. The engine groaned but didn't catch. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping on the driver's side window. My heart slammed in my chest. I didn't want to look, but instinct forced my eyes over. The man's eyes met mine through the glass, cold and unblinking, a look that didn't belong to a stranger just trying to get home. His hand lifted slowly, tapping again, then tracing a lazy circle on the fogged corner of the window. I locked the doors, the click a small comfort, but my breath was shallow and fast. I wished I had remembered to bring my phone. It was on the passenger seat, screen cracked, nearly dead. I reached for it but hesitated. If I unlocked the door to grab it, he might try to get in. If I called out, who would hear me out here? Then, a sound from the passenger side, another tap, followed by the scrape of nails on the metal door. My mind spun, imagining the worst. 2 people? How many had been standing there all along? I scanned the dark woods lining the highway but saw nothing. The man stepped back suddenly, vanishing into the shadows. I held my breath, listening for any other sounds, but all I heard was the steady drip of rain from the leaves above. The engine turned over, struggling, then roared back to life. I didn't hesitate this time. I slammed the gear into drive and peeled away from the spot, tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. My headlights swept the roadside, but nothing followed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching from the darkness, waiting for me to slow down. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, the one I'd seen earlier. It was closed, lights off, but at least it was familiar ground. I locked the car and sat for a long time, eyes darting between the darkened building and the empty road. The hum of distant traffic was a welcome noise, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I didn't call anyone that night. I just kept the doors locked and waited until dawn, when the road was busy again with morning commuters. Whatever that man wanted, whatever he was, I wasn't ready to find out. Not yet. Morning came hesitantly, gray and hesitant, like the world was still holding its breath. I kept the car locked until the first few headlights passed, then eased the doors open and stepped out. The cold air bit into my skin, but it was relief, not pain. I glanced back at the dark building, its windows opaque and uninviting. That shadow was still there, waiting. Or maybe it had never left at all. I started walking toward the diner across the street, the one now bathed in warm light and the murmur of early chatter. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered, swallowing me into a bubble of normalcy I hadn't realized I needed. The waitress gave me a tired smile, and the smell of coffee grounded me. For a moment, the nightmare outside felt distant, like a bad dream slipping away in the light of day. But as I sat there, nursing a lukewarm cup, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already marked. That the man, whatever he was, had seen something in me, or maybe inside me, that pulled him here. I didn't know what he wanted, only that the quiet days ahead would be anything but peaceful. The road outside stretched endlessly, but I couldn't tell if it was leading me away from the darkness, or straight into its waiting arms. The late afternoon sun was folding into twilight when I left the office building. I had stayed longer than usual, buried in spreadsheets and emails that piled up like a small mountain on my desk. On the ride home, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, a habit I'd picked up recently, an instinct, really. The streets were emptier than usual. A few pedestrians hurried past, heads down against the sharp wind that had started to blow. I parked in the usual lot behind the apartment complex. It was the kind that felt exposed, open to the street with barely any cover, something I had always disliked but accepted because the rent was reasonable. I grabbed my bag and started walking toward my building, the settlement of my keys in my palm the only sound besides the crunch of gravel underfoot. At first, everything seemed normal. The streetlights flickered on, casting pale halos over the cracked pavement. The air smelled faintly of burnt leaves and damp concrete. But as I neared the entrance, I noticed a car parked just past the second lamp post, an old, dark sedan with tinted windows. It wasn't the kind of car you'd expect to see in the neighborhood, especially at this hour. I looked away quickly, trying not to look like I was staring. I told myself it was probably someone waiting for a friend, maybe a delivery driver taking a break. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught the outline of a figure sitting in the passenger seat, hunched forward, face obscured but unmistakably watching me. My skin prickled. I quickened my pace. Inside the lobby, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I pressed the elevator button repeatedly, glad for the small distraction of its ding. When the doors slid open, I stepped inside and hit the button for the 4th floor. The doors closed slower than usual, as if reluctant to shut. On the ride up, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. No notifications. Just the screen lit up with a missed call from an unknown number. My heart skipped. I debated calling it back but decided against it. The elevator dinged on my floor, and I stepped out. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew. I hurried down the corridor, keys ready in my hand, trying to shake off the dread settling like a stone in my stomach. As I reached my door, I noticed something, scratch marks on the wood frame near the lock. They looked recent, raw, like something had been scraped there in frustration or haste. My hand trembled as I slid the key in and turned it. The door swung open easily. Inside, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. I flicked on the lights, checking each room quickly. The couch, the kitchen counter, the bedroom, all as I left them. My breath was shallow, my ears straining for any sound beyond the hum of the refrigerator. I told myself I was imagining things. I locked the door behind me and doubled the deadbolt. Then I checked the windows, latched tight. The silence pressed in on me as I paced the living room, my fingers twitching. I kept thinking about that car and the figure in the passenger seat. Had I been followed here? The phone buzzed again. Another missed call from the same unknown number. I finally called it back. Hello? No answer. Just silence. I hung up, my hands cold. I left the phone on the coffee table and went to the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peek out. The street was empty. The sedan was gone. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. Maybe this was a coincidence. Maybe I was just tired, jumpy from working late. But the marks on the door frame told a different story. Later, as I prepared dinner, I kept hearing sounds, soft knocks on the walls, tapping that stopped when I stopped moving. I told myself it was the building settling, or pipes contracting in the cold. Still, I felt eyes on me, a presence just beyond my vision. That night, I slept with the lights on, the door locked tight. But when I woke, the feeling hadn't left. The marks on the door were still there, and the unknown number had called 3 more times, always silent on the other end. The sense of being watched, followed, was no longer paranoia. It was real. And it was only getting worse. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But then the whispers started. Not loud enough to make out words, just faint, breathy murmurs coming from the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It crept beneath my skin, twisting my thoughts into knots. Last night, I must have finally snapped. I stood in the middle of the living room, the phone clenched in my shaking hand, staring at the door that bore those deep, angry scratches. Then I heard it, a soft knock, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the apartment. No one could have been there but me. I forced myself forward, heart hammering, to the bedroom closet. When I flung it open, the darkness inside seemed to pulse, as if breathing. And then, I saw it, a pair of eyes, reflecting the dim light like shards of glass. They blinked once, then vanished into the shadows. Now, I don't know what's worse, the watching, the calls, or the fact that I'm beginning to question what's real and what isn't. Every mirror shows a flicker, a shadow just out of reach. Every silence feels like a prelude. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on before whatever this is pulls me under completely.